Section 1. The Show Beneath the Show. Here is something that almost nobody talks about when they talk about Family Guy. Underneath every cutaway, underneath every chicken fight and every Conway Twitty bit, and every joke that went on 30 seconds too long and then 30 seconds longer still, because someone in the writer's room thought commitment made something funnier even after the thing it was committed to had long since stopped being funny. Underneath the fart gags and the celebrity cameos and the increasingly mean-spirited treatment of a teenage girl who just wanted somebody to acknowledge she existed. Underneath the escalating Peter, underneath the pontificating Brian, underneath the Stewie who went from murderous evil genius to something softer and more pleasant and considerably less original. Underneath all of that, there was a completely different show happening. It was quieter than the version most people watched. It moved slower. It cared more. It had things to say about loneliness and failure, and the strange way that love and resentment can exist inside the same person at the same time, sometimes directed at the very same person, sometimes indistinguishable from each other, in the way that things can become indistinguishable when you have lived with them long enough. It was a show about what it feels like to be ordinary, in a world that keeps telling you ordinary is not enough. It was a show about the gap between who you thought you were going to be and who you actually became. It was a show about a family that drove each other absolutely crazy and loved each other anyway, even when they had completely forgotten how to say so, even when the mechanisms for saying so had gotten so rusty from disuse that using them felt more awkward than simply not saying anything and hoping the feeling got through some other way. And it ran for over 20 years, directly underneath the version that won the ratings and generated the merchandise and got moved from Sunday nights to Wednesday nights. Like a piece of furniture nobody was sure what to do with anymore, but nobody wanted to be the one to throw away. The version most people talk about when they argue about Family Guy's decline is the surface version. That is the version where Peter Griffin gets dumber every season, and the transformation from lovable buffoon to active menace happens so gradually that you barely notice until you go back and watch an episode from season 2 and realize the man on screen and the man in the recent episodes share a name and a face and essentially nothing else of substance. That is the version where Brian develops opinions that take up more screen time than actual plot, where the dog, who was once the grounded emotional center of the show, became the loudest person in every room he entered, while simultaneously becoming the character with the least self-awareness. That is the version where Stewie's murderous genius quietly retired to make room for a softer character who had feelings about things and went on adventures, and had a friendship that was genuinely touching, but who had surrendered the thing that made him unlike anything else on television. That is the version where Meg became a target, and stayed a target for roughly a decade straight, where the jokes about her shifted from gentle observations about teenage invisibility to something considerably harder to look at, where an animated character who had been built with genuine interiority was repeatedly reduced to a punchline, and the punchline was always the same punchline. And all of that is real. All of that happened. The surface version of Family Guy genuinely did decline, and the people who have spent hours documenting exactly how and why are working from accurate material. But that version of the conversation misses something enormous. It misses the fact that Family Guy, even in its worst seasons, was doing something underneath the noise that deserves to be looked at on its own terms. It misses the way the show was quietly building one of the most emotionally complete portraits of working-class American life that animated television ever attempted. It misses the way every major character, including the ones who got turned into punchlines, was carrying a specific kind of interior weight that the show rarely addressed directly, but almost never stopped depicting. It misses the way that the architecture of what McFarlane and his original writing team built in those first 3 seasons was so structurally sound that even when everything on top of it started shifting and crumbling, the foundation kept doing its work. You could feel it underneath the bad episodes, the same way you can feel a solid floor underneath a room that needs repainting. This is not a defense of the bad episodes. Some of the things Family Guy did in its later seasons were genuinely indefensible, and wrapping them in a reading of the show's deeper intentions does not change what they were on the surface. But the question this script is interested in is different. The question here is not whether the surface version of the show declined. It did. The question is, what was actually going on in the version that ran beneath the surface? The one that most people absorbed without realizing they were absorbing it. The one that is probably the reason so many people who will tell you the show went downhill in season whatever, still find themselves watching it anyway at 11:30 on a Wednesday when they cannot sleep. Because here is what is interesting. You can go back and watch the worst seasons of Family Guy, and if you watch them looking at the wrong thing, you see exactly what the critics see. You see a show coasting on its own reputation. You see writers stretching jokes past the point of function. You see characters behaving in ways that seem designed to generate a reaction rather than to tell a story, which is a very different thing from a show that has bad episodes. Because a show that has bad episodes because it is trying to tell a story, and failing is doing something fundamentally different from a show that has bad episodes because it stopped trying to tell stories. But if you watch those same seasons looking at a different thing, if you stop watching the surface and start watching what is moving underneath it, a completely different show comes into focus. The jokes are still there, the cutaways are still there, the extended bits and the shock value and all of it are still there. But underneath that, a family is still going about its business. A man who does not understand the world around him is still waking up every morning and trying to get through the day with the equipment he has, which is not the ideal equipment for getting through the day, but it is his equipment, and he uses it with a consistency that is almost admirable. A woman is still holding a household together with a combination of patience and strategic ignorance about exactly how bad things actually are at any given moment, because some household management requires not knowing certain things very precisely. A baby is still working through something enormous in the language of a character, whose whole premise is that enormous feelings require enormous gestures to express them, that the size of the feeling should be commensurate with the size of the expression, that you do not respond to being unseen by becoming quieter. A dog is still nursing a specific kind of grief that he has never figured out how to put words to, which is unfortunate because he is technically a very good writer, or believes himself to be one, which is not quite the same thing but is close enough to sustain the belief. The secret version of Family Guy is not hidden in any one episode. It is not a single plot thread that the show pulled back to reveal at some dramatically appropriate moment. It is something that you have to construct yourself, piece by piece, from everything the show told you and everything it left unsaid. It is built from the moments between the cutaways. From the looks that characters give each other when the joke has landed and the scene has a second before it moves on. From the way certain storylines keep returning in new forms, as if the show itself cannot stop thinking about a particular problem, even when it pretends to be interested in something else entirely. From the texture of how a family moves through the same house over 25 years, the way the relationships between people accumulate and change and accumulate again, even when the show's surface structure insists that nothing can ever really change. It is built from the things the show knew about its characters that the characters did not know about themselves, from the things the show knew about working-class American life that it expressed through the specific gravity of how its characters moved and spoke and made decisions. From the way a fictional small city in Rhode Island became, over the course of its run, one of the most honest portraits of a certain kind of American experience that popular entertainment has ever produced, not by trying to be serious about that experience, but by being consistent about it, by returning to it season after season, by treating it as the natural ground of everything else. What follows is an attempt to put that version of the show into words, to trace its architecture, to follow its emotional logic from the very beginning of the series to wherever it eventually arrived. This is not going to be a straightforward summary of what Family Guy was about, because you already know what Family Guy was about, at least the version most people watched. This is something different. This is an attempt to describe the show that was running underneath the one you remember. The one that ran while you were laughing at the chicken fights. The one that kept going while the extended bits played out. The one that never entirely stopped being what it was, even when everything around it was telling it to be something else. It starts, as almost everything in Family Guy starts, with Peter. But not the Peter most people think of when they think of Peter Griffin, in the years when the show had settled into its later patterns. Not the loud one who has abandoned any pretense of consequence or accountability. Not the one who gets progressively more chaotic as the seasons accumulated until the character on screen bore primarily a physical resemblance to the character who had started the whole thing 25 years earlier. The other Peter. The one who showed up in the gaps between jokes. The one who, if you were watching closely enough and with sufficient patience, and without the distraction of the surface content, was never really performing stupidity at all. He was performing something much more specific, and much harder to name, and it had been running underneath every scene he was ever in, right from the first episode. But before we get to Peter, and before we get to any of the other characters who were carrying their own hidden weight through all of it, drop a comment down below and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing who is out there with me. And if you have not subscribed yet, please go ahead and do that now. It costs nothing, and it genuinely helps more than you might think. Section 2. Peter Griffin's Secret Loneliness. There is a specific way that Family Guy introduced Peter Griffin in its very first episode, and if you watch that introduction now, knowing everything you know about how the character eventually developed over 25 seasons, and through every creative decision that pulled him in different directions, it reads almost like a document of something that was later lost. Not a mission statement exactly, and not a promise, but something closer to a statement of original intent that the show would spend the rest of its life both honoring and contradicting in turns. The year was 1999. The episode was called Death Has a Shadow, and in the opening minutes of that first episode, you see Peter sitting in what appears to be a family counseling session, and he is telling the counselor about what he watches on television. The joke is that he has been watching adult programming that his church's parental filter was supposed to block, and he is defending himself with the earnestness of a man who genuinely believes he has done nothing wrong. He makes his argument with confidence. He has thought it through. After a fashion, he has arrived at a position that makes complete sense from inside his own head. The humor comes from the gap between Peter's confidence and the situation. He thinks he is making a completely reasonable argument. Everyone around him can see that he is missing the point entirely. He is not missing the point because he is stupid in a simple way. He is missing the point because he is interpreting the situation through a completely different set of assumptions about what the situation is. That gap was the engine of Peter's character for the first 3 seasons of the show, and it was the thing that made him genuinely funny in a way that translated into something more than just laughing at an idiot. He was not stupid in the way that became standard later, where stupidity meant cruelty and chaos and the complete absence of normal human responsiveness to other people's states. He was stupid in a much more specific and much more human way. He genuinely could not read the room. He consistently misjudged how things were going. He had strong opinions about everything and the analytical tools to assess almost none of them. He thought he understood situations that he did not understand. He made decisions based on information that was incomplete in ways he could not detect, because the incompleteness was not in the facts, but in the framework he was using to interpret the facts. What this produced, in the early seasons, was a portrait of a man who was fundamentally out of step with the world around him and did not know it. Not a dangerous man, not a cruel man, not a man who was performing ignorance as a cover for something else. A man who was running his life on information that was slightly wrong, slightly out of date, slightly miscalibrated, and who kept bumping into reality's edges without ever quite figuring out why things did not turn out the way he planned. The early Peter had plans. They were always slightly off in their initial assumptions. The plans ran into the world and the world did not cooperate and Peter had to improvise. The improvisation was usually worse than the plan. Things would spiral. Eventually something would resolve, usually through a combination of accident and genuine feeling, and the episode would end with the household having survived whatever had happened to it this week. This structure was not random. It was doing something specific. If you watch enough of those early episodes in sequence, what you see is a portrait of a man whose emotional intelligence is genuine and whose practical intelligence is limited, and the gap between those two things is the source of almost everything that happens to him. Peter loves his family. This is never in question in the early seasons. It is as fundamental to the character as anything else, more fundamental than his stupidity, which is a trait rather than a core quality. The love is the core quality. The stupidity is the thing that keeps getting in the way of the love finding appropriate expression. He tries to tell Lois he loves her, and it comes out wrong. He tries to demonstrate that he cares about his kids, and the demonstration goes sideways. He tries to be a good friend to Joe, or Quagmire, or Cleveland, and the friendship gets tangled up in something he did not anticipate. He keeps trying. He keeps not quite succeeding. He keeps being forgiven by the people around him, not because he has earned forgiveness in any explicit way, but because the trying is visible enough that the people who love him can see it, even when the outcome is a mess. If you were watching those early seasons carefully, what you were actually watching was loneliness. Not the melodramatic kind of loneliness that shows up in serious dramas and gets scored with sad music, and depicted in long, quiet scenes of a person staring out a window at something that signifies their interior state. The kind of loneliness that Family Guy was showing with Peter was the working-class American variety, which is quieter and less legible, and far more common. It is the loneliness of a man who has a wife and children and friends and a house and a job, all the external ingredients of what everyone around him recognizes as a full life, and who still manages to exist in a kind of permanent slight disconnection from everything around him. He loves the people in his life with genuine force. He does not really understand them. He is trying his best, and his best is persistently, reliably almost good enough. Think about the way early Peter related to his wife. Lois is intelligent and capable and emotionally sophisticated in ways that Peter simply is not. She processes the world at a level of complexity that Peter cannot quite access. She has emotional needs that Peter has trouble reading, not because he does not care about them, but because he cannot always decode them, because the emotional language that would let him accurately receive what she is telling him was never part of his education in any formal or informal sense. He grew up in a household where emotional communication was not the primary mode of engagement. He learned to express care through action, through presence, through showing up, through being there in a physical sense even when he was not quite there in an emotional one. He learned to receive care the same way. The more sophisticated exchange that Lois sometimes needs, the exchange of emotional precision and mutual understanding, is not something he has the equipment for, and he knows it at some level, even if he could not describe knowing it. This is the thing that produces a very specific kind of loneliness. The loneliness of someone who loves deeply and cannot fully connect, who reaches toward the person they love and arrives just slightly short, who can feel the gap between what they mean and what gets received but cannot figure out how to close it. It is not the loneliness of isolation. It is the loneliness of proximity without complete access, of being right next to the person you love and still not being entirely there with them. Think about the way early Peter related to his friends at the bar. Joe and Quagmire in Cleveland were the people he spent most of his non-work, non-family time with, and that bar was depicted as a genuine refuge. These were his people. He belonged there in a way that he did not quite belong anywhere else. But even in those early scenes, there is something slightly off about how Peter fits. He laughs at things that are not quite what everyone else is laughing at. He misses certain references. He brings up things at the wrong moment. He is in the group, but not entirely of the group, in the way that people who do not quite track the social temperature of a room are always simultaneously included and slightly outside. This is a real experience and a common one. There are people in every social group who belong without fully connecting, who are genuinely liked without being fully understood, who have found their people and still manage to stand a half step outside the circle of full mutual comprehension. It is not a tragic condition. It does not prevent genuine affection or genuine enjoyment. But it is lonely. Quietly, persistently lonely, in a way that beer and television and Friday nights can soften but never entirely fix. Peter's relationship with his own father, Francis Griffin, was one of the places where the show came closest to making this loneliness explicit. Francis was a deeply religious, deeply critical man who had never found it easy to be warm with his son. In the episodes that explored their relationship, particularly the earlier ones where the writing was still doing this kind of work carefully and with intention, you could see the entire architecture of Peter's adult emotional life laid out. He had grown up in a household where love was there but approval was withheld, where the primary mode of parental engagement was correction rather than affirmation, where you knew your father loved you in the abstract, but the specific form that love took was pointing out what you were doing wrong. He had taken that household and tried to build something different with Lois, and he had mostly succeeded in the structural sense. His own household was warmer, louder, more chaotic, more accepting. But the interior inheritance from Francis was still there, running underneath everything. The need to prove something that could never quite be proved. The sense that he was probably getting something wrong that everyone else had figured out. The persistent low-grade suspicion that the world was operating on rules he had never been given, and that everyone else seemed to navigate without much difficulty. This is the thing that Peter's later transformation actually destroyed, and why the destruction felt so significant to people who had been watching from the beginning and who had absorbed this original version of the character without necessarily being able to articulate what they had absorbed. When the show turned Peter from a lovable fool into something crueler and more purely chaotic, it was not just changing his behavior, it was eliminating the interiority that made him sympathetic. The later Peter was a cartoon of a cartoon, a simplified version of an already exaggerated premise. The earlier Peter was a portrait of a specific kind of man that millions of viewers recognized from their own lives and families. A man who was not bad, who was not especially good at being good, who loved his wife and did not always show it in ways she could receive, who loved his kids and sometimes expressed that love in ways that landed like something else entirely, who wanted things to be better and consistently lacked the equipment to make them so. One of the most underrated episodes in the show's entire run is the Season 1 episode where Peter gets his driver's license revoked and manages to cause a television blackout for the entire town. The episode is remembered primarily as a Peter episode, a showcase for the character's particular brand of obliviousness. But if you watch it carefully, what you are actually watching is a man discovering that he has been using television as a way to avoid being present in his own life, that the television was mediating his relationship with everything, including his family, in a way that allowed him to be physically present without being genuinely present, and that when the television is gone and he has to actually sit with his family and be a husband and father without anything to fill the space, he does not know what to do. He is a stranger in his own living room. The show did not make this explicit. It almost never made anything this emotionally direct explicit, not in those early seasons that preferred to show rather than explain. But it was there, in the way Peter kept trying to find new things to fill the space that the television had been filling, in the way that Lois quietly continued doing the things she had always done while the television was gone, because those things had never required the television, in the way the episode ended with Peter not really having learned anything deep or transformative, but having been, for one episode, deprived of the thing he used to stay comfortable rather than present. There are episodes in the much later seasons, ones from periods when the overall quality of the show had declined significantly from anything resembling the early standard, where early Peter briefly reappears, where the man who does not understand the world but loves his family shows up through the current version of the character, the way someone's original face sometimes shows through their older one in a photograph. A moment of genuine tenderness that was not in the script in any obvious way. A hesitation before a joke that suggested something real was being considered. A look at Lois that had everything in it. These moments are the secret version of Peter insisting on existing, even in the context of the other version. They are the foundation making itself known. The loneliness was always there underneath it, because it was built into the original architecture of who he was, and the original architecture held even when everything built on top of it was changing. Section 2. Peter Griffin's Secret Loneliness. There is a specific way that Family Guy introduced Peter Griffin in its very first episode, and if you watch that introduction now, knowing everything you know about how the character eventually developed over 25 seasons, and through every creative decision that pulled him in different directions, it reads almost like a document of something that was later lost. Not a mission statement exactly, and not a promise, but something closer to a statement of original intent that the show would spend the rest of its life both honoring and contradicting in turns. The year was 1999. The episode was called Death Has a Shadow, and in the opening minutes of that first episode, you see Peter sitting in what appears to be a family counseling session, and he is telling the counselor about what he watches on television. The joke is that he has been watching adult programming that his church's parental filter was supposed to block, and he is defending himself with the earnestness of a man who genuinely believes he has done nothing wrong. He makes his argument with confidence. He has thought it through, after a fashion. He has arrived at a position that makes complete sense from inside his own head. The humor comes from the gap between Peter's confidence and the situation. He thinks he is making a completely reasonable argument. Everyone around him can see that he is missing the point entirely. He is not missing the point because he is stupid in a simple way. He is missing the point because he is interpreting the situation through a completely different set of assumptions about what the situation is. That gap was the engine of Peter's character for the first 3 seasons of the show, and it was the thing that made him genuinely funny in a way that translated into something more than just laughing at an idiot. He was not stupid in the way that became standard later, where stupidity meant cruelty and chaos and the complete absence of normal human responsiveness to other people's states. He was stupid in a much more specific and much more human way. He genuinely could not read the room. He consistently misjudged how things were going. He had strong opinions about everything and the analytical tools to assess almost none of them. He thought he understood situations that he did not understand. He made decisions based on information that was incomplete, in ways he could not detect, because the incompleteness was not in the facts but in the framework he was using to interpret them. What this produced, in the early seasons, was a portrait of a man who was fundamentally out of step with the world around him and did not know it. Not a dangerous man, not a cruel man, a man who was running his life on information that was slightly wrong, slightly out of date, slightly miscalibrated, and who kept bumping into reality's edges without ever quite figuring out why things did not turn out the way he planned. The early Peter had plans. They were always slightly off in their initial assumptions. The plans ran into the world, and the world did not cooperate, and Peter had to improvise. The improvisation was usually worse than the plan. Things would spiral. Eventually, something would resolve, usually through a combination of accident and genuine feeling, and the episode would end with the household having survived whatever had happened to it this week. This structure was not random. It was doing something specific. If you watch enough of those early episodes in sequence, what you see is a portrait of a man whose emotional intelligence is genuine and whose practical intelligence is limited, and the gap between those two things is the source of almost everything that happens to him. Peter loves his family. This is never in question in the early seasons. It is as fundamental to the character as anything else, more fundamental than his stupidity, which is a trait rather than a core quality. The love is the core quality. The stupidity is the thing that keeps getting in the way of the love finding appropriate expression. He tries to tell Lois he loves her, and it comes out wrong. He tries to demonstrate that he cares about his kids, and the demonstration goes sideways. He tries to be a good friend to Joe or Quagmire or Cleveland, and the friendship gets tangled up in something he did not anticipate. He keeps trying. He keeps not quite succeeding. He keeps being forgiven by the people around him, not because he has earned forgiveness in any explicit or calculated way, but because the trying is visible enough that the people who love him can see it, even when the outcome is a mess. If you were watching those early seasons carefully, what you were actually watching was loneliness. Not the melodramatic kind of loneliness that shows up in serious dramas and gets scored with sad music, and depicted in long, quiet scenes of a person staring out a window at something that signifies their interior state. The kind of loneliness that Family Guy was showing with Peter was the working-class American variety, which is quieter and less legible and far more common. It is the loneliness of a man who has a wife and children and friends and a house and a job, all the external ingredients of what everyone around him recognizes as a full life, and who still manages to exist in a kind of permanent, slight disconnection from everything around him. He loves the people in his life with genuine force. He does not really understand them. He is trying his best, and his best is persistently, reliably, almost good enough. Think about the way early Peter related to his wife. Lois is intelligent and capable and emotionally sophisticated in ways that Peter simply is not. She processes the world at a level of complexity that Peter cannot quite access. She has emotional needs that Peter has trouble reading, not because he does not care about them, but because he cannot always decode them, because the emotional language that would let him accurately receive what she is telling him was never part of his education, in any formal or informal sense. He grew up in a household where emotional communication was not the primary mode of engagement. He learned to express care through action, through presence, through showing up, through being there in a physical sense even when he was not quite there in an emotional one. This is the thing that produces a very specific kind of loneliness. The loneliness of someone who loves deeply and cannot fully connect, who reaches toward the person they love and arrives just slightly short, who can feel the gap between what they mean and what gets received, but cannot figure out how to close it. It is not the loneliness of isolation. It is the loneliness of proximity, without complete access, of being right next to the person you love and still not being entirely there with them. Think about the way early Peter related to his friends at the bar. Joe and Quagmire and Cleveland were the people he spent most of his non-work, non-family time with, and that bar was depicted as a genuine refuge. These were his people. He belonged there, in a way that he did not quite belong anywhere else. But even in those early scenes, there is something slightly off about how Peter fits. He laughs at things that are not quite what everyone else is laughing at. He misses certain references. He brings up things at the wrong moment. He is in the group, but not entirely of the group, in the way that people who do not quite track the social temperature of a room are always simultaneously included and slightly outside. There are people in every social group who belong without fully connecting, who are genuinely liked without being fully understood, who have found their people and still manage to stand a half step outside the circle of full mutual comprehension. It is not a tragic condition. It does not prevent genuine affection or genuine enjoyment, but it is lonely. Quietly, persistently lonely, in a way that beer and television and Friday nights can soften but never entirely fix. Peter's relationship with his own father, Francis Griffin, was one of the places where the show came closest to making this loneliness explicit. Francis was a deeply religious, deeply critical man who had never found it easy to be warm with his son. In the episodes that explored their relationship, particularly the earlier ones, where the writing was still doing this kind of work carefully and with real intention, you could see the entire architecture of Peter's adult emotional life laid out. He had grown up in a household where love was there but approval was withheld, where the primary mode of parental engagement was correction rather than affirmation, where you knew your father loved you in the abstract but the specific form that love took was pointing out what you were doing wrong. He had taken that household and tried to build something different with Lois, and he had mostly succeeded in the structural sense. His own household was warmer, louder, more chaotic, more accepting, but the interior inheritance from Francis was still there, running underneath everything. The need to prove something that could never quite be proved. The sense that he was probably getting something wrong that everyone else had figured out. The persistent low-grade suspicion that the world was operating on rules he had never been given, and that everyone else seemed to navigate without much difficulty. This is the thing that Peter's later transformation actually destroyed, and why the destruction felt so significant to people who had been watching from the beginning and who had absorbed this original version of the character without necessarily being able to articulate what they had absorbed. When the show turned Peter from a lovable fool into something crueler and more purely chaotic, it was not just changing his behavior, it was eliminating the interiority that made him sympathetic. The later Peter was a cartoon of a cartoon. The earlier Peter was a portrait of a specific kind of man that millions of viewers recognized from their own lives and families. A man who was not bad, who was not especially good at being good, who loved his wife and did not always show it in ways she could receive, who loved his kids and sometimes expressed that love in ways that landed like something else entirely, who wanted things to be better and consistently lacked the equipment to make them so. One of the most underrated episodes in the show's entire run is the Season 1 episode where Peter gets his driver's license revoked and manages to cause a television blackout for the entire town. The episode is remembered primarily as a Peter episode, a showcase for the character's particular brand of obliviousness. But if you watch it carefully, what you are actually watching is a man discovering that he has been using television as a way to avoid being present in his own life. That the television was mediating his relationship with everything, including his family, in a way that allowed him to be physically present without being genuinely present. And that when the television is gone, and he has to actually sit with his family and be a husband and father without anything to fill the space, he does not know what to do. He is a stranger in his own living room. The show did not make this explicit. It almost never made anything this emotionally direct explicit, not in those early seasons that preferred to show rather than explain. But it was there, in the way Peter kept trying to find new things to fill the space that the television had been filling, in the way that Lois quietly continued doing the things she had always done while the television was gone, because those things had never required the television. The episode ended with Peter not really having learned anything deep or transformative, but having been, for one episode, deprived of the thing he used to stay comfortable rather than present. Even in the much later seasons, ones from periods when the overall quality of the show had declined significantly from anything resembling the early standard, early Peter would briefly reappear. The man who does not understand the world but loves his family showing up through the current version of the character, the way someone's original face sometimes shows through their older one in a photograph. A moment of genuine tenderness that was not in the script in any obvious way. A hesitation before a joke that suggested something real was being considered. A look at Lois that had everything in it. These moments are the secret version of Peter insisting on existing even in the context of the other version. They are the foundation making itself known. The loneliness was always there underneath it because it was built into the original architecture of who he was. And the original architecture held, even when everything built on top of it was changing. Section 3. Brian's unfinished novel and what it was really about. There is a joke in Family Guy that is technically about failure, but is actually about something considerably more precise and more universal than failure. It runs through almost every storyline that involves Brian Griffin's writing career and the specific relationship he has with his own ambition and his own talent, and the gap between those two things, which is in some ways the most honest thing the show ever depicted about anyone. The joke is that Brian has been working on a novel for years. The novel is never finished. It is always almost done, but never actually done, hovering in a state of perpetual near completion that serves some psychological purpose that is not explicitly the purpose Brian would give if asked about it. Brian talks about it with the seriousness of a man who believes the novel is going to be his defining statement to the world. Other characters receive this information with a range of responses from polite skepticism to outright mockery, and both responses miss what the unfinished novel is actually doing in the economy of Brian's life. If you take the joke at face value, it is a simple character-establishing detail. Brian is a failed writer. Moving on. But if you sit with it longer, the unfinished novel becomes one of the most psychologically precise pieces of character writing in the entire show. Because what the unfinished novel is actually about is not failure. Failure would require the completion of the novel and the world's rejection of it. The unfinished novel has not failed. It has not been tried in any way that would produce failure. It exists in a state of permanent potential, which is to say, it exists in a state of permanent protection from the test that would determine whether the potential is real. This is not laziness. Lazy people do not keep a manuscript in a drawer for years. They simply do not write the manuscript. What Brian is engaged in is something more specific and more agonizing, which is the maintenance of a self-image through the perpetual deferral of the test that would confirm or deny that self-image. He is a writer in the way that someone with an unfinished business plan on their hard drive is an entrepreneur. The plan keeps the identity available. The identity is purchased at the cost of never actually submitting it to the scrutiny of the world. Brian is not afraid of finishing the novel because he does not have enough ideas. He talks about the novel with enough fluency and enough specificity that you believe he has thought about it extensively, that there is a thing inside him trying to get out, that the problem is not the absence of material, but the presence of terror. He is afraid of finishing the novel because finishing it would mean finding out whether he is actually a writer or just a person who believes himself to be a writer. The distinction matters enormously because his entire self-concept is organized around the belief. If the belief turns out to be wrong, the self-concept collapses. The unfinished novel is not evidence of his failure, it is his insurance against the definitive confirmation of it. As long as the novel is not finished, it cannot be rejected. As long as it cannot be rejected, Brian can continue to be the thing the novel makes him in his own imagination. This is a portrait of a very specific psychological strategy that an enormous number of people employ with their own versions of the unfinished novel. The business idea that stays an idea. The screenplay that stays at page 47. The painting that is 90% done and has been 90% done for 3 years, sitting in a corner, covered with a cloth, available to be pointed at when the conversation calls for evidence of creative ambition. The thesis that only needs one more chapter. The song that only needs the bridge. The project that would prove something about who you are if you ever actually completed it, which is precisely why completing it carries such enormous risk, and why, at every moment when completion seems close, something else urgently requires your attention. The show began developing this dimension of Brian's character in the very first season, and never entirely let it go. Even in the later seasons, when the surface Brian had become insufferable in ways that obscured a lot of the original character, the unfinished novel was still there, still being referenced, still not finished. The show returned to it again and again, not because it was a reliable laugh, but because it was doing something true. It was maintaining, in the background, the portrait of a particular kind of creative person that the original Brian had been built to represent. Brian drank throughout the entire series, from the very first episode to the most recent ones, and the way the show handled his drinking underwent its own kind of transformation that mirrors everything else about the character's trajectory. In the early seasons, Brian's drinking was depicted with a complexity that was unusual for an animated comedy. He drank because he was unhappy. He drank because the gap between who he wanted to be and who he was had become a thing that required regular management, a dial that needed adjusting, a volume level that needed bringing down from a level that was otherwise too loud to function at. He drank in the way that people drink when they are trying to be a slightly better or slightly more bearable version of themselves for a few hours. And the show understood that about him without either condemning it or celebrating it. He was not a drunk in the cartoonish sense. He was a drinker in the specific sense of someone whose relationship with alcohol was functional, but not entirely healthy. And the show depicted this accurately enough that it resonated with people who had similar relationships with similar substances. There is a moment in an early episode where Brian is sitting at the bar, after a long sequence of events, and he just looks tired. Not tired from exertion, tired in a deeper way. The kind of tired that comes from carrying something around for too long and having no very clear idea of how to put it down. The show does not linger on it. The scene moves on in the way that Family Guy scenes always move on, with momentum and the next thing arriving before you have quite finished with the last thing. But it was there. A moment of genuine fatigue visible underneath the character's usual surface presentation. The relationship between Brian and Lois was another place where the secret version of his character showed up most clearly and most consistently. Brian had feelings for Lois. This was established early, in the way the show established things early, quietly and without fanfare, through a look here and a comment there, and an accumulation of small signals that combined into something unmistakable without any individual moment being definitive. And the way the show handled this, particularly in the early seasons, was not played for cheap drama or easy laughs. It was treated as one of the most purely human things about Brian. He had fallen for the one woman in his immediate world who was genuinely good, genuinely whole, genuinely the kind of person whose company improves every situation she is part of. And she was married to his best friend, and he had enough self-awareness and enough real affection for both of them to keep that feeling mostly buried. He did not act on it in ways that damaged anyone. He carried it. He managed it with a discipline that was genuinely admirable, and that the show depicted as an ongoing quiet achievement rather than a source of drama. He occasionally let it surface in small ways. A look held a beat too long, a compliment that had slightly more warmth in it than the moment called for. The people around him either did not notice or generously chose not to acknowledge what they noticed. And Brian continued to be present and loyal and good, without asking for anything in return from either of the two people his feelings implicated. What this depicted was a portrait of unrequited feeling handled with genuine dignity, which is a rare thing in any kind of storytelling and a very rare thing in animated comedy, which tends toward the external and the loud and the explicitly stated. Brian's feelings for Lois were internal and quiet and expressed only obliquely, which is how such feelings are actually carried by people who have decided not to act on them. The show trusted the audience to read what was there without being told what to read, and the early audience rewarded that trust with the kind of attention that allowed the subtlety to land. The secret version of Brian Griffin is not the pompous intellectual that later seasons turned him into. The secret version is a dog who ended up living with the best possible family for him, and knew it, even when he could not say so. Who had dreams that he was probably never going to fulfill and had made something approaching a functional peace with that, not the complete peace that would require either achieving the dreams or genuinely abandoning them, but the working peace of someone who has decided to carry both the dream and the non-fulfillment simultaneously, and see how far that gets them. Who loved two people very much in two very different ways and had decided that the most honest expression of that love was to protect both of those people from the discomfort that his feelings for them might cause if they were fully expressed. Who drank just enough to take the edge off of being exactly that self-aware, because that level of self-awareness at full strength would have been genuinely difficult to live with. That character ran underneath the entire series. Even in the seasons where the surface Brian had become insufferable in ways that made him one of the most complained about characters in the show's history, there were moments when the original version surfaced. A scene with Stewie that had real warmth in it, the specific warmth of two beings who found their only genuine comprehension in each other. A moment where Brian looked at Lois and you could see the whole early history of the character in his expression, the whole long maintenance of a feeling that could not be put down and could not be acted on. a scene where he said something genuinely kind and generous, without any of the pontificating or the self-congratulation that had accumulated around him over the years. The novel, finally, is also about the show itself. Family Guy is an enormously long piece of work that its creator stepped back from before it arrived at any natural conclusion. McFarlane's relationship with the show, particularly in its later years, where he was present enough to voice the characters every week, but absent enough that the creative direction had been handed to other people, mirrors Brian's relationship with the novel in ways that are probably not entirely coincidental. The project was too important to abandon, and too complex, or too exhausting, or too entangled with the rest of everything to actually bring to a fully realized conclusion. So it kept going, season after season, always in production, always carrying the potential of being something that it had partly already been, and might, under the right circumstances, be again. Brian's unfinished novel is the show looking at itself. Section 4. Stewie's terror was never about Lois. The thing that made Stewie Griffin one of the most original characters in the history of animated television was not the weapons. It was not the world domination plans, though the plans were extravagantly elaborate and conceptually delightful, in ways that rewarded close attention. It was not even the accent, though the accent was a perfect piece of characterization. A British villainous lilt in the body of an American baby. The comedy of incongruity made Sonic. The thing that made Stewie irreplaceable was the specificity of what his villainy was actually pointed at. Not at the world, not at humanity in the abstract, at his mother, at the one specific person who held the most complete power over his existence. Stewie wanted to kill Lois. This was his defining characteristic for the first 3 seasons, and it returned, with decreasing frequency, through several more seasons after that. He built elaborate machines for this purpose. He schemed and plotted and monologued. He stared at her with barely contained malevolence while she spooned baby food into his mouth with a spoon shaped like an airplane, making the airplane noise, entirely unaware of the profound homicidal calculations happening behind her child's eyes. He described his plans for her destruction with a relish that was genuinely funny, precisely because the target of all that elaborate, sophisticated, technically advanced evil was a woman who was currently giving him a bath and singing to him about ducks. But here is the thing that the show understood, even if it never said it out loud. The villainy was not really about Lois, not as a person, not as someone who had done anything specific to deserve the specific intensity of what Stewie directed at her. Think about what Stewie actually is. He is a baby. He is 1 year old, give or take whatever episodic inconsistencies the show accumulated over time. He is completely, physically, totally dependent on his mother for everything that matters. She feeds him, she bathes him, she determines where he goes and what he sees and when he sleeps and what clothes he wears and what the entire perimeter of his daily experience looks like. She controls every meaningful aspect of his existence with a thoroughness that would be alarming if considered from the outside, but which is simply what caring for an infant actually looks like. And she does all of this while having essentially no idea who he actually is. She does not know about the weapons. She does not know about the plans. She does not know about the intelligence that is operating inside the infant body. She has dressed in a yellow shirt and a diaper and settled into a high chair. She looks at Stewie and she sees a baby. She has full access to his exterior and no access to his interior. She responds to him with warmth and genuine love and completely misapplied interpretation, hearing his words as babbling, interpreting his silences as contentment, his elaborate schemes as whatever it looks like when a 1-year-old arranges their toys in a particular pattern. The murderous rage, read through this lens, is not really about wanting Lois dead. It is about wanting to be seen. It is about the specific fury of a consciousness that cannot get itself recognized by the person most responsible for recognizing it. It is the experience of being radically misunderstood by someone who loves you, and of being unable to correct their misunderstanding because the medium through which you would correct it is not available to you in the form it would need to take. Stewie cannot explain himself to Lois. She cannot hear him the way he needs to be heard. The communication between them is asymmetric in the most frustrating possible way. She thinks she understands him and she does not, and he understands her entirely and cannot make that understanding visible to her. And so the feeling that this generates, the explosive frustration of existing in a relationship of radical dependency with someone who fundamentally does not see you, gets expressed in the only idiom available to him, the idiom of villainy, evil genius plots, world domination schemes. The fantasy of one day being so enormous, so undeniable, so impossible to overlook, that she could not possibly continue to misread him. This is the secret emotional core of early Stewie, and it is not actually dark. It is actually about something very common and very human. The desire to be genuinely known by someone who claims to love you. The frustration of being reduced to a role, in Stewie's case the role of baby, in ways that do not leave room for who you actually are. The desperate need to become large enough in some way that the people around you cannot continue to see only what they expect to see rather than what is actually there. Every person who has ever felt like they were performing a version of themselves for their family that did not match who they actually were is in some structural sense Stewie. Every person who has ever sat at a holiday dinner and listened to relatives describe them in terms that have not been accurate for a decade is familiar with the low-grade version of Stewie's murderous rage. Every teenager who has ever been addressed as the child they used to be by parents who have not updated their internal image knows what Stewie is expressing with his laser guns. The difference is scale. Stewie builds weapons capable of significant destruction. Most people just grip their fork a little tighter and wait for the dinner to end. The show developed this emotional subtext most fully in the dynamic between Stewie and Brian, which was one of the most genuinely moving relationships in the entire series. Brian was the only one who could hear Stewie. He was the only character who received the real version of Stewie rather than the baby version. And what this made him was not just a friend, but something closer to a witness. Someone whose presence said, "You are real. The version of you that nobody else can see is real. I am here." This is why the early Stewie Brian scenes land with more emotional weight than their surface content should probably allow. They are funny. The comedy is there, the contrast between the baby genius and the drinking dog, the deadpan exchanges about plans for world domination that Brian receives with the weary familiarity of someone who has heard this particular kind of thing before. But underneath the comedy, the scenes are about the profound relief of being genuinely known by someone, of finding the person in your world who can hear you when everyone else is hearing something else entirely, of having your interior life confirmed as real by someone who is actually capable of receiving it. Brian was not a convenient audience for Stewie's villainy. Brian was Stewie's evidence that the villainy was being accurately perceived, that the person Stewie was registering in someone else's consciousness as real. The friendship was, from the beginning, organized around this act of recognition. Brian saw Stewie. That was the foundation. Everything else grew from there, over years and seasons and adventures and arguments and reconciliations that accumulated into one of the richest relationships in the show's history. The decision to phase out the evil genius and replace it with a softer, more emotionally open version of Stewie was made gradually and then defended on the grounds that the original concept had been exhausted. There is something to that argument in the narrow sense. Any premise has a ceiling if you approach it in only one way. But the argument misses what was actually lost. What was lost was not just the specific jokes about wanting to kill Lois. What was lost was the emotional architecture behind them. The softer Stewie was a genuinely interesting character in many respects, and the friendship with Brian deepened in ways that produced some of the best episodes of the middle seasons. But the softer Stewie did not carry the same emotional precision. He did not have the specific thing that early Stewie had, which was a fury that was actually a portrait of the most universal human need, the desire to be seen by the person who loves you most and sees you least. The show had built in those early Stewie storylines something that would have been worth more than any number of adventures if it had been maintained. A character whose most extreme feature was actually his most human quality. The weapons were a magnification of the frustration that every dependent person feels. The world domination plans were a fantasy of becoming so undeniable that misrecognition would finally be impossible. Stewie's story is a love story, in the end. It is a story about a baby who wanted his mother to actually know him, who could not figure out how to make that happen through any available normal channel, and who responded to the impossibility by scaling his expression to a size that could not be ignored. The killing Lois jokes were never about wanting Lois dead. They were about wanting Lois to look up from what she was doing and see who was actually sitting in the high chair. She never did, but the audience always did, and that is the contract the show made with the people who loved early Stewie. It was making the invisible visible. It was saying, this is what it looks like when you are seen only partially by the person who is most responsible for seeing you fully. And it was doing it through the comedy of a murderous baby, which is maybe the most effective delivery mechanism ever devised for that particular truth. Section 5. Meg Griffin and the Art of Being Invisible. Before Meg Griffin became the show's designated punching bag, before the abuse escalated to a level that made even casual viewers uncomfortable, before the decade of increasingly explicit cruelty that turned her story into something genuinely troubling to sit with, there was a version of Meg that the show established in its first 3 seasons and then largely abandoned. The abandonment was so complete that it is easy to forget the original version existed at all, to look at the later Meg and assume she had always been what she became rather than understanding her as someone who was turned into something. That version of Meg was not interesting in the way that the other family members were interesting. She was not funny in an immediately obvious way. She was not the engine of any particular kind of comedy. She was, by design, ordinary. She was the teenager in the family. She wanted to be liked by people who did not particularly like her. She tried to be cool and consistently fell short by small margins that were somehow worse than falling short by large ones, because falling short by small margins implies you can see where the line is and just cannot quite reach it. She had crushes on boys who did not know she existed. She came home from school to a house full of chaos and tried to exist alongside it, with the dignity of someone who has decided to pretend the chaos is not happening because acknowledging it would require a reaction, and reactions take energy she needs for other things. And that ordinariness was, in the early seasons, the entire point of her character. She was the human scale against which the rest of the family's absurdity could be measured. When Stewie was monologuing about world domination, and Peter was doing whatever he was currently doing, and Brian was trying to have a sophisticated conversation in a household that was not built for sophistication, and Lois was holding everything together through a combination of love and practical intelligence, Meg was there being a teenager. Just a teenager. Trying to get through high school without being too humiliated. Trying to get her parents to notice her. Trying to find a way to be a person in a family that constantly threatened to drown out any individual signal with its collective noise. There is something specific that the early show was doing with Meg that deserves considerably more attention than it typically receives. It was using her as the show's emotional baseline, the register of what ordinary feeling looks like in a household full of extraordinary feeling. When the family had a moment of actual connection, or when something genuinely affecting happened in the life of the household, Meg's response was the index of how a normal person would experience that moment. She felt things at the scale that actual feelings are felt. She was hurt by things that would hurt a real person. She wanted things that real teenagers want, which is to say she wanted to be seen and valued and liked, and to have a place in the world that felt like it had been reserved specifically for her, rather than given to her by default, because nobody else was using it. This made her, in the early seasons, the character through whom the show's genuine warmth was most clearly visible, because Meg wanting her family's love and not always getting it in the form she needed was relatable in a way that Peter's obliviousness or Stewie's evil genius could never quite be. Everyone in the audience had either been the Meg of their family or had known a Meg, the slightly overlooked one, the one who did not have a personality extreme enough to demand attention in a household where the competition for attention was intense. The one who had to compete for notice with people who were constitutionally incapable of not taking up space and who did not have the equipment for that competition, and who responded to losing the competition with a dignity that was sometimes mistaken for not caring. The shift from this Meg to the Meg who became the show's permanent victim is one of the most uncomfortable transformations in the series. In the early seasons, Meg's position in the family was a gentle reflection of a real social phenomenon. Some children are the invisible ones. Some teenagers go through years of their adolescence essentially overlooked by the people around them, not because they are bad or because anyone hates them, but because the combination of their personality and their environment produces a kind of invisibility that is both ordinary and genuinely painful. Depicting that with warmth and recognition is an act of real empathy. It says to everyone who was that teenager, you were real, your experience was real, your desire to be seen was not a character flaw but a human need, and you are seen now, here, by this show that decided your experience was worth depicting. The escalation to active abuse said something very different. It started saying, some people are beneath contempt. Some people exist to absorb the cruelty that other people need to express. Some people's suffering is funny because they are the kind of people whose suffering is funny. These are not things that any thoughtful person would endorse as statements about actual human beings, but these are the statements the show began making about Meg through the cumulative weight of how it treated her. And the thing about cumulative weight is that you do not need to make the statement explicitly. You just need to repeat the action enough times that the statement becomes implied. The season 10 episode that focuses on the family stuck together during a hurricane is often discussed as the worst example of the show's treatment of Meg, the episode where the philosophy underlying the abuse became most explicit. But there is another reading available, one that fits the secret version of the show considerably better. In that reading, the speech that Meg gives, the one where she finally says everything she has never been allowed to say, is the show briefly bringing the hidden Meg to the surface. The Meg who has been carrying all of this. The Meg who knows exactly what has been done to her, and exactly what it means, and has been absorbing it with a kind of quiet dignity that nobody around her has ever acknowledged. When she speaks that truth out loud, the family does fall apart, not as a joke at her expense, but as an indictment of what the family has been requiring from her. The family cannot survive being told the truth about itself. The truth is too destabilizing. And so Meg swallows it again, and the family reassembles. That reading does not make the episode good or its resolution anything other than deeply problematic. But it reveals that underneath the comedy, the show was depicting something real about how families sometimes function, about the specific role that one member of a family sometimes ends up playing, absorbing and containing the dysfunction, so that everyone else can maintain their comfortable fictions about who they are. The Secret Meg is a character of genuine moral seriousness. She is a portrait of a particular kind of strength that looks, from the outside, like weakness. The strength of continuing to love people who treat you badly because you understand, at some level, that their treatment of you is not a verdict on your worth, but a reflection of their own damage. The strength of remaining present in a situation that does not deserve your presence, because you have decided that presence matters, regardless of whether it is rewarded. That is not a comedy character. That is a figure from a different, harder kind of story. And the fact that she existed inside a comedy, buried under decades of jokes about her appearance and her unwantedness, makes her one of the most genuinely affecting characters the show ever produced. Not because of the abuse, which did not make her affecting, but because of who she kept being underneath it. Because the actress who gave her her voice never stopped playing her as a real person. Because the original architecture of the character, built with genuine care in those first 3 seasons, was too solid to be entirely dismantled by anything that was layered on top of it afterward. Meg Griffin is the show's most honest character, in the end. She wants something ordinary and is denied it repeatedly and keeps wanting it anyway, because the wanting is real, and the reality of the wanting does not depend on whether it is ever satisfied. Section 6. The town as a living thing. There is a town in Family Guy, and it exists somewhere in Rhode Island. And Rhode Island is the smallest state in America, and this is not a coincidence. The choice of setting was not arbitrary or simply biographical, though McFarlane's time studying at the Rhode Island School of Design clearly informed it in ways both specific and atmospheric. Rhode Island has a very particular character that the show absorbed into its bones from the very beginning and never entirely let go of, even in the seasons when everything else was changing. It is small, it is old, it has a specific kind of post-industrial personality, the personality of a place that used to be more important than it currently is, and that keeps the memory of its former significance alive in its architecture and its attitudes, without being entirely sure what to do with that memory. It is a state where the past sits very close to the surface, where you can feel the weight of previous centuries in the buildings, and the street layouts, and the way certain neighborhoods still carry the social organization of industries that have long since moved elsewhere. It is a state where the future does not always seem entirely assured. The town in the show is a fictional version of that sensibility, constructed with enough internal consistency that it feels real in the way that fictional places feel real when the people who made them actually know the texture of the world they are depicting. It is a small city that operates like a big small town, where everybody knows each other's business, without necessarily knowing each other particularly well. It has a main street that has clearly seen better days. The kind of main street that used to anchor a commercial district, and now has more vacancies than it should, and is slowly being supplemented by a strip mall somewhere nearby that nobody is particularly happy about, but which everyone continues to use. It has a bar that functions as the social center for a certain kind of man. It has churches and schools and hospitals, and all the apparatus of civic life, deployed with the slightly frayed quality of institutions that are doing fine but not thriving, that are maintaining themselves but are not growing. In the early seasons of the show, the town was not just a backdrop against which the comedy happened. It was a character in its own right, with its own rhythms and its own personality and its own way of responding to the events that unfolded inside it. When something happened, everyone reacted. Mayor West appeared, doing whatever Mayor West was doing, which was usually something that required you to believe that someone had actually elected this person to a position of civic responsibility. The police appeared, usually in the person of Joe Swanson, who was the show's most fully realized portrait of civic service and its specific toll. The neighbors showed up with opinions. The town was alive in the way that small cities are alive, full of specific social textures and specific people who have specific histories with each other. What the town was depicting, in its gentle way, was the social ecosystem of working-class American life in the early 21st century. This is a social ecosystem that has been depicted plenty in American culture, but usually from the outside, with either condescension that makes it something to be pitied, or sentimentality that makes it something to be protected from its own complexity. The show depicted it from inside, with the residents' familiarity that lets you see both the warmth and the limitation without either sentimentalizing the limitation or pathologizing the warmth. The bar where Peter and his friends gathered deserves more attention than it usually receives in conversations about what Family Guy was doing. It was the most consistent location in the show, apart from the Griffin House itself. And what it depicted was one of the most honest portraits of how a certain kind of community actually works. It was not glamorous. It was not a destination. It was a place where a handful of men who had known each other for years could sit with their drinks and talk about things that did not matter very much, and occasionally about things that mattered a great deal. The bartender refilled glasses without being asked because he had learned the rhythms of these particular customers. Nothing got resolved, but everything got slightly more bearable, and that is what the place was for. The friendship group at the bar, Peter and Joe and Quagmire and Cleveland, was depicted in those early seasons as something genuine and somewhat rare. Four adult men who had found a stable social formation and were maintaining it with the particular fidelity of people who understand that this kind of thing is harder to find than it looks. They were not alike. They were not particularly compatible in any theoretical sense. These were people who had found each other through proximity and had decided to stay together through habit and then through genuine affection, which is how most real long-term friendships actually work. Not through compatibility in the abstract, but through accumulated shared experience and the specific warmth that comes from having someone who has known you long enough to remember who you were before you were who you currently are. Joe Swanson's character arc across the whole series is worth considering in the context of what the town was doing as a character. When Joe arrived in the first season, he was the cool new neighbor, the decorated police officer, the man in a wheelchair who moved through the world with a physical capability that made his disability seem almost incidental, who had clearly refused to let his condition define or limit him in ways that everyone around him found genuinely admirable. Peter was jealous of Joe in that early episode, not because of the wheelchair, but because of the ease with which Joe generated respect and affection from everyone he encountered. What the show did to Joe over time was a version of what it did to Meg, though with different specific content. It took a character who had been established as genuinely admirable and gradually stripped away the admirable qualities, until what was left was primarily a vehicle for a particular kind of joke. The jokes became about the wheelchair. The disability that had been depicted as a feature of Joe's life that he navigated with remarkable grace became the primary lens through which he was seen. This is the town doing what small communities sometimes do to the people in them. The way that intimacy of the small community kind can turn an individual's fixed circumstances into a kind of permanent social label. The way people who have known each other for years can stop seeing each other and start seeing only the thing they have decided the other person fundamentally is. The town also carried the economics of its world in its texture, in a way that shaped every character decision, without ever becoming explicit content. Peter's job at the brewery was a specific kind of job with specific limits on what it could provide. The Griffin House was a specific kind of house that communicated a specific economic position. The choices the family made were shaped by a budget that was real and occasionally visible, and the fact that the show depicted a family that was working class without either sentimentalizing that or treating it as a problem to be solved was itself a meaningful choice. Most television families live in houses that are far nicer than the occupational status of the characters would actually support. This is a known phenomenon, the way that production design inflates the material circumstances of fictional characters. Family Guy did this less than most shows, maintaining a household whose economic reality was more accurately matched to the economic position of a brewery worker in a small New England city. This grounding was part of what made the early show feel true, in the specific way it felt true, and it was part of what the show's original audience recognized and responded to. The town is also, in a way that the show never made entirely explicit but that was always available as a reading, a portrait of a particular historical moment in American life. Rhode Island is where American industrial capitalism began. The first water-powered cotton mill in America was in Pawtucket, which is right next to Providence, which is right next to where the show is set. The state's history is deeply wound up with manufacturing and labor, and the specific social structures that those things produced. And by the early 21st century, when the show was depicting life there, that history was present primarily as absence. The mills were museums or condominiums or empty lots. The manufacturing was gone. The social structures were still there in their outlines, but the economic content that had originally generated them was largely depleted. This is the world that Peter Griffin grew up in and continued to inhabit. A world where the kinds of stable, dignified working-class lives that previous generations had built were becoming harder to maintain, where the job at the brewery represented not a launch point but an end point, a full life if you could hold on to it, but not a thing that was going to grow or develop into something else, where the bar was full, because there was nowhere else to go, and nothing much better on offer. The show never made any of this explicit, but the town carried it. And if you knew where to look, you could see it in the architecture, and the social life, and the quiet background economics of everything that happened there. Section 7. The cutaways were memory. Here is a theory about cutaway gags that the show never stated, and may not have entirely intended, but which fits the evidence better than any alternative explanation that has been proposed, including the simplest one, which is that the cutaways were random. The cutaways in Family Guy are not random. They have never been random. They are structured to look random, to mimic the associative quality of genuine human memory, but they are actually doing something specific and consistent that becomes clear when you stop looking at individual cutaways and start looking at the patterns they form across episodes and seasons, across the entire run. The cutaway is always triggered by a reference. A character says something, and the reference to something else is what sends the show somewhere else, for 30 seconds, or 3 minutes, or whatever the current episode's sense of proportion has determined. The mechanism is explicit. Something in the present moment is being measured against something from the past. The present is being contextualized through memory. This is exactly how human memory works. Not in its factual retrieval mode, where you are trying to remember a specific piece of information and you reach deliberately into your memory to find it, but in its associative mode, where a sensory experience, or an emotional state, or a conversational reference suddenly pulls up something from years or decades ago that the conscious mind was not looking for and did not know it needed. A smell that reaches back 20 years to a specific afternoon that had been essentially inaccessible until the smell unlocked it. A phrase that brings back a whole afternoon in a particular year. A song that produces a feeling from an entirely different decade of your life, sharp and unexpected and complete, as if no time at all had passed between then and now. The early cutaways in Family Guy were doing something that the later cutaways, when they became longer and more dominant and more detached from the specific emotional logic of the episodes they appeared in, mostly stopped doing. They were the associative layer of Peter Griffin's mind. They were showing you not what was happening in the present, but what Peter was connecting it to, what his brain was reaching toward when the present moment pressed on something that had been laid down earlier in his life. Think about the cutaway structure from Peter's perspective specifically, because the cutaways are most naturally Peter's device. They come most often from his mouth. They are most clearly organized around his specific set of references and his specific way of processing information through comparison and analogy. Peter is a man who processes the world through association and reference more than through direct analysis. He does not sit with an experience and think about it carefully. He lives in a constant stream of incoming information that he sorts by comparing it to things he has already experienced. New thing appears, find the old thing it is most like, respond accordingly. The cutaway is the visual representation of this process. The screen becomes the inside of Peter's head for the duration of the gag. This is like the time I went to the dentist. Cut to Peter at the dentist doing something absurd. Cut back to the present. Peter has now processed the current situation by relating it to the dentist memory. He is ready to move on. The memory served its function, which was to give him a reference point for what he is currently experiencing. The experience is now filed. He can continue. What makes this reading particularly interesting is that it explains something about the cutaway humor that the randomness theory cannot. The cutaways are not random. They come from a specific mind with a specific set of references and a specific cultural history. The references skew toward the 70s and 80s because that is when Peter was young and the world was making its deepest impressions on him, laying down the material that would become the associative layer he would use to process everything that came afterward. They skew toward certain kinds of media, because that media diet is the specific one of a specific kind of American man of a specific generation. If you mapped all the cutaway references across the full run of the show, across 25 seasons and hundreds of episodes, what you would get is a portrait of a mind, not a random mind. A very specific and very consistent and very recognizable mind. A mind that processes experience associatively. A mind that is constantly reaching back into its own history to find the frame that makes sense of what is happening now. A mind that is, in this specific way, always living partially in the past even while the present is happening, always measuring the present against the accumulated weight of everything that came before it. The Conway-Twitty gag, which is often cited as the single most obvious example of lazy writing in the show's history, can be read through this lens as the most extreme version of the cutaway, doing what the cutaway always does. Something in the present moment triggered the Conway-Twitty association. The association came forward with its full force. The song played. The present was temporarily suspended while the past occupied the full screen, not the abbreviated past of a quick gag, but the full present tense past of a complete song being played from beginning to end. When the song ended, the present resumed. This is what happens in people's heads all the time. A memory surfaces, and for its duration, it is as vivid and present as the present itself. You are in the grocery store, and you are also in a different decade, because the song on the radio just pulled you there with a completeness that makes the grocery store feel slightly unreal. The Conway-Twitty gag is that experience rendered with cartoonish literalism. The memory comes forward. It plays out in full. It goes. The present resumes. None of this makes the Conway-Twitty gag not annoying. It is annoying. It is annoying in the way that intrusive memories are annoying, in the way that being pulled out of the present by something from the past is annoying, in the way that watching a show that is supposed to be moving forward suddenly stop and spend several minutes on something that has nothing to do with anything is annoying. But it is doing something with the idea of memory and time and the persistence of certain cultural artifacts in a certain kind of consciousness that is more interesting than the lazy writing reading gives it credit for. The cutaways also function as a kind of collective memory for the audience, and this function was something the show understood intuitively before it understood it theoretically. Part of what made the early cutaway gags so pleasurable was the recognition they produced. Oh yes, that is exactly how that thing was. That is precisely the texture of that particular cultural artifact from that particular period. The cutaway was not just Peter's memory reaching for a comparison. It was the show reaching across the screen and asking the audience to share the memory, to bring their version of it forward, to feel the specific pleasure of a shared cultural touchstone being activated in the same moment for everyone watching. This is why the cutaways that landed best were always the ones with the most specific cultural references. Not generic absurdist gags that could belong to anyone's mental landscape, but precise evocations of specific things that a specific generation of viewers had in common. The show was speaking a generational dialect with the early cutaways, using references that functioned as a kind of recognition signal, a way of saying to a specific audience, You and I are from the same cultural moment. We have the same things in our heads. We remember this together. The later seasons changed this when the cutaways became primarily about surprise and subversion rather than recognition. Primarily about doing something unexpected rather than evoking something shared. You can build a cutaway around an absurd non sequitur, and it will be funny in a different way, the way any well-executed absurdist comedy is funny. But it does not produce the intimacy of recognition. It does not make the audience feel like they are being seen by the show in the way that the best early cutaways made them feel. The connection between the cutaway overload and the character problems is also worth noting. When a show spends most of its time on disconnected random jokes, there is less time to develop characters. There is less time for meaningful dialogue. There is less time for the family to have real interactions that show who they are and how they feel about each other. The warmth that the early show had, the sense that the Griffins were a real family who loved each other despite their flaws, cannot exist in a show that spends half its runtime cutting away to unrelated gags. The cutaways did not just replace the comedy, they replaced the heart. The secret story of the cutaway is a story about how human consciousness actually works. Associatively, backward-looking, constantly cross-referencing the present against the accumulated weight of the past. Peter Griffin's brain was not random. It was a very specific and very human kind of mind, and the cutaways were its most honest self-portrait. Section 8. The marriage at the center of everything. There is a version of Family Guy that is essentially a 25-year study of one marriage, and that version is arguably the show's greatest achievement. Everything else, the adventures and the cutaways and the secondary characters and the running gags and all of it, everything orbits around the marriage at the center of the show, with the kind of gravitational inevitability that suggests the orbit was not incidental. It was the point. The marriage is the single most consistent piece of emotional content in the entire run of the series. More consistent than any character trait, more consistent than the humor style, more consistent even than the basic format of the show. Whatever else was changing, Peter and Lois remained at the center. Peter and Lois Griffin. Together since college, a history the show referenced occasionally but never fully explored, leaving space for the imagination to fill in what they might have been like before the kids, and the house, and the brewery job, and all the ordinary life that accumulated around them. Living in a house in a small city, going through the ordinary days of a life that is not particularly remarkable from the outside, and is, from the inside, the entire world. The show understood this marriage very well in its early seasons, and understood it differently, though not always worse, in its later ones. What changed was the surface texture and the emotional temperature. What did not change was the fundamental structure of two people who had chosen each other and continued to choose each other, imperfectly and with significant friction, and through circumstances that might have broken a more fragile commitment, because the alternative had never actually presented itself as preferable. In the first 3 seasons, Peter and Lois were portrayed with a specificity that sitcom marriages rarely achieve. They were not the template marriage, not the long-suffering wife and the lovable idiot husband filling archetypal roles without much variation. They were a specific couple with a specific history and a specific set of dynamics that had developed between them over years of being together in the particular way that people who have been together for years develop their dynamics. Through accumulated small decisions and accumulated small adjustments, and the gradual arrival at an equilibrium that is neither what either person planned nor entirely unsatisfying. Peter loved Lois with a genuineness that his later transformation mostly buried but never quite destroyed. Even in the worst seasons, even when Peter was doing things that the season 1 Peter would have recognized as wrong, there were moments where the love surfaced, and it was as real as anything in the early episodes. A look that held something real. A throwaway line that had all the history of the relationship in it. A moment where his guard came down, and the simple fact of what he felt for her was temporarily visible. Lois loved Peter in a way that was considerably more complicated than his love for her. And this complication was one of the most honest things the early show depicted. She came from money. Her family was wealthy in the way that old New England families are wealthy, with the accumulated assets and the particular social manner and the slightly bewildered contempt for people without similar assets. Her father made his contempt for Peter barely concealed on the grounds that barely concealed contempt was more civil than fully expressed contempt. She had presumably had other options at the point when she chose Peter. She chose him anyway. Why? The early show was circumspect about making this entirely explicit, understanding that the most honest answers to why people love whom they love are not always the answers that reflect well on anyone, but the most accurate answer, the one that the show kept returning to in various oblique forms, was something like this. Lois recognized something in Peter that she needed. She needed someone whose relationship with the world was uncomplicated, in ways that her own world had not been. She needed someone who found joy easily and expressed it without calculation. She had grown up in a household organized around the appearance of adequacy rather than the practice of warmth, and she had gone toward the warmest possible thing she could find, even if the warmth came attached to considerable chaos. The fights between Peter and Lois were the place where the marriage was most visible. In the early seasons, the fights followed a pattern that the show executed, with consistent emotional honesty. Peter would do something wrong in the specific way of Peter, which was usually some version of failing to consider the effect of his actions on the people around him. Lois would be hurt or frustrated in the specific way that Lois got hurt or frustrated, which was with a disappointment that was always tinged with recognition, because she had known who Peter was when she chose him, and the disappointment was never entirely surprise. Peter would eventually understand that he had been wrong. He would apologize. Not always in words, sometimes in actions, in gestures, in showing up at the right moment in the right way, and the marriage would repair itself. This is how long marriages actually work. Not through the resolution of all underlying tensions, not through the arrival at a state of complete mutual understanding, through the renewal of commitment in the aftermath of friction, through both people deciding, implicitly or explicitly, that what they have together is worth the cost of having it. The early Family Guy understood this, and depicted it with an accuracy that was unusual for its genre. The warmth that Peter and Lois had in the early seasons was not the warmth of a romance. It was not the warmth of attraction or novelty, or the early stages of love when everything is illuminated by desire. It was the warmth of a long partnership, of two people who had been through enough together that the relationship had its own substance, independent of either of them, something they had built together that was bigger than what either of them had brought to it. That kind of warmth is quieter and less dramatic than romantic warmth, but it is more durable and in some ways more moving, because it has been tested and has survived. The later seasons changed the surface character of the marriage without entirely changing its underlying structure. The warmth became less reliable. The repairs became less complete. The emotional temperature dropped in ways that reflected the broader changes happening to both characters. But even in the worst seasons, there were episodes where the original marriage was clearly visible, where Peter did something that was specifically and accurately loving, that came from a genuine understanding of what Lois needed, where Lois looked at Peter, and the look contained the whole history of what they had built together. Those moments are the secret version of the marriage, the version that ran underneath the comedy, and underneath the changes, and underneath everything that accumulated around both characters over 25 years. They are what the show kept returning to, because the marriage was the emotional center of gravity around which the entire series had been organized from the very beginning, the axis around which everything else rotated. A show can run for a long time and drift in many directions, but if the center holds, even intermittently, even imperfectly, there is something to return to. The center of Family Guy was always this marriage. And the marriage, however much its surface changed over time, was always there at the bottom of the show, doing the work that centers do, which is to give everything else something to orbit around. Peter and Lois is the spine of the secret version of this show. Everything else is attached to it. Section 9. Chris and the weight of expectations nobody talks about. Chris Griffin is the most overlooked character in Family Guy, and the reason he is overlooked is somewhat by design, but also somewhat by the way the show organized its own attention. He sits in the middle of a very demanding cast in terms of the attention they require. Meg's situation demands attention because it is distressing. Stewie demands attention because he is brilliant and original. Peter and Lois demand attention because they are the center of the show. Brian demands attention because he is positioned as the audience's point of identification. In this company, a big, sweet, somewhat slow teenage boy is going to need a very strong story or a very distinctive mode of comedy to pull attention toward himself, and Chris usually had neither. He had the gentle weirdness. He had the specific comedic mode of someone who is operating with slightly less information than the situation requires, and processing the resulting confusion with more equanimity than might be expected. He had a few recurring elements, most notably the evil entity in his closet during the early seasons, which was perhaps the show's most intriguing piece of unexplored mythology. And he had the shadow of his father, which was so prominent and so complete that in his quieter episodes it was the most interesting thing about him. Chris is Peter's son in a way that Meg is not Peter's daughter, and Stewie is not Peter's child, and the comparison is instructive. Meg and Peter share a household and a legal relationship and a history, and very little else in terms of native temperament or fundamental orientation toward the world. Stewie's relationship with Peter is primarily performed at the level of the family's external dynamics because Stewie's real life is happening at a level Peter cannot access. But Chris is Peter, or is becoming Peter, in the way that children sometimes become the parent they are most like, absorbing through proximity and observation, and the thousand small ways that a parent teaches without teaching, until the child's personality has taken the shape of the thing it spent its formative years near. The physical similarity was the most obvious element. Chris was drawn as a younger version of Peter's body type, and the show used this sometimes for visual comedy and sometimes for something more pointed. When Peter did something foolish, and Chris did the same thing in the same episode, the repetition was not just structural comedy. It was the show depicting inheritance, the way that the child learns from the parent, not the lessons the parent intends to teach, but the lessons the parent cannot help demonstrating. What Peter demonstrated, consistently and without intending to, was a particular relationship with the mind. Peter's anti-intellectualism was not aggressive or hostile in the early seasons. It was simply a philosophy, stated through practice rather than declaration, that thinking hard about things was not something he was going to do. The world could be processed through instinct and appetite and loyalty and immediate sensation. Peter moved forward into whatever was happening, with a confidence that did not come from preparation, but from a general conviction that things would work out somehow. Chris absorbed this philosophy. He absorbed his father's physical comedy orientation toward the world, the way of engaging with environment through action and reaction rather than reflection. He absorbed his father's relationship with authority, which was not defiant in any principled way, but perpetually distracted, consistently failing to respond to authority on its own terms, because he was not entirely paying attention to authority's terms. He absorbed his father's pattern of not thinking before acting, which in Peter was a feature of character that the audience had learned to accommodate and love, and which in Chris was a feature of development, a habit being formed before the character had finished forming, which meant it was not just Peter's limitation being reproduced, but potentially something that could have gone differently under different conditions. The something that could have gone differently was the art. Chris could draw. The show depicted this in multiple episodes across the series, treating his visual talent as a genuine thing, rather than a joke, giving him the specific relationship with an artistic medium that the show generally reserved for characters the audience was supposed to take seriously as having interior lives. His drawings were good, not precociously good in a way that strained credibility, but genuinely competent in a way that suggested a real eye, a real sense of how to put things together visually. The talent was there, and the talent was not being developed in any sustained way, and the show knew this and occasionally returned to it with a clarity that was uncomfortable. The household Chris was growing up in was not built for the sustained development of artistic talent. It was built for warmth and chaos and survival, and the maintenance of the family's basic functioning. The specific kind of encouragement and sustained attention that developing an artistic gift requires was not what the Griffin household provided. Peter would not have known how to provide it even if he had been aware of the need, because his own relationship with art was entirely passive and consumptive rather than creative. What the show was quietly depicting with Chris and his undeveloped talent was the way that class and household and environment shape not just what people achieve, but what they understand themselves to be capable of attempting. Chris was not going to become an artist, not because he lacked talent, but because nothing in his world was telling him that becoming an artist was a realistic thing for someone like him to become. The gap between his talent and his trajectory was not a function of individual failing, it was structural. It was the gap that exists between what people could be in the right conditions and what they become in the actual conditions available to them. This is one of the most quietly honest things the early show did. And it did it through a character who was primarily there for comic relief. The kid with the unambiguous talent who was not going to develop it, not because of tragedy or drama, because of the accumulated weight of an environment that could not sustain what the talent needed. The relationship between Peter and Chris was the most naturally affectionate in the show, and the show was honest about why. Peter and Chris wanted the same things from each other: physical presence, shared enthusiasm for simple pleasures, the same television shows, the same food with the same appetite, the same kind of trouble, and the same sense that the trouble was funny. They could be together without effort in a way that Peter's relationships with his other children could not quite replicate. The show depicted this with affection, and with the quiet sorrow that affection for something limited always carries. It was good that Peter and Chris had each other. It was good that the son had found his father available in the way that his father was available. But underneath the goodness was the limitation, running parallel to it, never quite separable from it. The relationship that was most comfortable was the relationship that was most constraining. The company Chris could keep most easily was the company that kept him from becoming who he might otherwise have been. The show depicted this without ever making it the subject of an episode, because some truths are too quiet and too structural to survive becoming the subject of an episode. They live better in the background, carried in the texture of things. Section 10. The friendship that held the whole thing together. There is a moment in a Season 8 episode that is unlike almost anything else in the show's entire run. Brian and Stewie are locked in a bank vault together overnight. The episode was made with an explicit creative intention to do something different, to strip away the show's usual architecture and see what happened when two characters were left alone with nothing but each other and an empty bank vault and the whole long night. There are no cutaways. There is no external plot. There is no secondary story happening elsewhere in town that will eventually intersect with the one in the vault. There is just a dog and a baby sitting together, talking to each other, for the duration of the episode. And what they say in that vault is the most honest thing either character ever says about who they are. Brian reveals that he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box. He reveals why. He has thought about using it on himself. Not as a passing dark thought that comes and goes, not as a momentary intrusion that he can dismiss without much difficulty, but as a genuine contingency plan for a level of despair he has not yet reached, but can see from where he is. He has kept the option available, because keeping it available does something for him that he cannot quite achieve any other way, which is the specific relief of knowing that there is an exit if the situation becomes unendurable. Stewie's response to this is the emotional center of the episode, and one of the most affecting moments the show ever produced. He does not have a clever response. He does not turn it into a joke. He does not offer advice or practical suggestions, or the kind of therapeutic language that a less honest piece of writing would have reached for. He simply tells Brian, in the direct and unadorned way that the character is capable of when he is not performing, that if Brian were gone, he would be devastated. That the world without Brian in it would not be a world he could manage to inhabit properly. That Brian's continued existence is not a background fact of his life, but one of the primary things his life is organized around. This is what the friendship between Brian and Stewie was always about, underneath the road trips and the adventures and the banter. It was about two creatures who were both, in very different ways, fundamentally isolated, and who had found in each other the one relationship in their respective lives that offered genuine mutual recognition. Brian was isolated because he was a dog in a human world, which sounds like the premise of a joke, and is also one of the show's deepest and most consistently developed emotional facts. He was a being of genuine intelligence and genuine feeling, living in a context that would never fully accept him as a peer. He could talk, he could think, he could form opinions and hold conversations, and engage with ideas at whatever level the conversation required. And at the end of the day, he was still the family dog. He still had a relationship with the world that was mediated by his species in ways that could not be overcome through individual effort or exceptional ability. He was always slightly outside, always looking in, always the one whose access to the room was slightly more provisional than everyone else's. Stewie was isolated for the reasons developed earlier. He was a consciousness that could not be understood by the people around him. He was operating at a level of complexity and intensity that his environment could not register. He was speaking, effectively, in a language that nobody in his immediate world could hear. With one exception, Brian heard Stewie. This simple fact was the entire foundation of the relationship, and it was the most important fact about either character. The mutual comprehension between them was not incidental. It was what made everything else possible. Brian heard Stewie. Stewie had Brian's full attention. Not the partial attention that adults give to babies, but complete attention. The attention you give someone when you understand that what they are saying is actually what it appears to be. In the early seasons, this was the deepest intimacy available in the show. Two beings who had found each other, each of whom was isolated in their own way and for their own reasons, and who had discovered in each other the specific relief of being genuinely received. The relationship grew from there. Adventures happened, conflicts happened. The friendship deepened through the accumulation of shared experience in the way that all genuine friendships deepen, through surviving things together, through the accumulation of a shared history that exists independently of either person, but belongs to both of them. The Road to series was the fullest expression of what the friendship could achieve when given room to operate. Take Brian and Stewie out of the domestic context of the Griffin household, remove them from the secondary cast and the weekly plot structure, and what you have is two profoundly different beings navigating an unfamiliar world together. The adventures were often spectacular in their ambition and absurd in their specifics. But the heart of every road trip episode was always the friendship, always the two of them working out who they were to each other in the specific circumstances of wherever they had ended up. The first of the road trip episodes established the template with a clarity that later entries in the series built on but never quite surpassed. Stewie and Brian are stranded together on the way home and have to navigate a series of obstacles before they can return to their ordinary lives. The obstacles are funny. The comedy of the episode is real and works well. But the episode is structured so that the obstacles are less important than what the process of navigating them reveals about the relationship. By the end of the episode, something has been established between Brian and Stewie that was not there at the beginning. Not a new feeling exactly, because the early season had already laid the groundwork, but a confirmation of the feeling, a making it real through shared adversity, a transition from a friendship that was felt to a friendship that had been tested. The later Road to episodes built on this foundation, with increasing ambition. Some of these worked better than others, but the best of them achieved something that very few animated episodes manage, which is the feeling of watching two characters who genuinely love each other navigate a world that neither of them fully understands, with the specific combination of competence and vulnerability and mutual support that characterizes the best friendships. The show around these episodes was sometimes in better shape and sometimes in worse shape, but the Brian and Stewie episodes were almost always good, because the foundation of the relationship was too carefully built to be easily undermined, because the specific dynamic of mutual recognition was too fundamental to be dissolved by whatever else was happening to the characters in other episodes. The episode where Brian dies and Stewie uses time travel to save him is the fullest expression of what the friendship meant. Stewie does not hesitate. He steals a time travel device and goes back and puts himself in the path of events and saves Brian's life. No calculation, no strategic assessment, just the most immediate and total expression of how much the friendship matters to him. Brian's absence in the episodes between the death and the resurrection is not played for comedy. It is played for what it is, the specific quality of a world from which one particular presence has been removed. This is what the secret version of the show understands about human connection, that the surface version sometimes lost track of. Some relationships are irreplaceable not because the other person is perfect or even particularly good, but because the specific combination of you and them produces something that exists nowhere else. Brian and Stewie together were something that neither of them was separately. They made each other better in ways that neither of them could have managed alone. More honest, more open, more willing to be seen. The friendship is the emotional spine of the entire series. It is the relationship around which everything else is organized. It is what the show kept coming back to even when everything else was in flux. Because the friendship between a dog and a baby, who found in each other the first relationship of genuine mutual recognition in their respective lives, is the most precise and most affecting thing Family Guy ever built. Section 11. The Revival and What It Revealed. When Family Guy came back from cancellation in 2005, something happened that nobody was talking about at the time, but that seems, in retrospect, quite significant. The revival revealed in ways that the original run had not needed to, what the show had actually been about. It revealed this not through any explicit statement or any conscious decision, but through the contrast it created between what the original show had been and what the revived show was becoming. You can see something most clearly sometimes in the moment when it starts to change. Because the change makes visible what the sameness had been hiding. The cancellation had been, among other things, a pressure test of a particular kind. When a show is canceled and the people who make it have to watch it go away, they are forced into a reckoning with what the thing actually was, what it meant to them, what it had been trying to do, why it mattered enough to mourn, and whether it mattered enough to fight for. The Family Guy cancellation produced a mourning that was unexpectedly large and unexpectedly active. The circumstances of the cancellation were specific in ways that shaped how the mourning expressed itself. The show had not been canceled because it failed creatively. The writing in those first 3 seasons was still sharp. The characters were still fully formed and generating the specific kind of comedy that had made the show beloved in the first place. It had been canceled because Fox kept moving it around the schedule without giving it a stable home. Scheduling problems are a network problem, not a creative problem, and this distinction was obvious to the audience that had loved the show. What they were mourning was not a show that had run its course, but a show that had been taken away before it was finished. This produced a particular kind of loyalty. Not the nostalgic loyalty of people mourning something that was over, which is a loyalty organized around the past, but the active, protective loyalty of people who believe something was taken from them and want it back, which is a loyalty organized around the possibility that the thing might return. The Adult Swim reruns were the mechanism through which this loyalty was demonstrated. The show aired in reruns on Cartoon Network's late-night block and found an audience that had been waiting for it. The ratings were not modest. The show dominated its time slot and boosted the block's overall viewership in ways that got people's attention and became proof that the audience was there and was loyal and was willing to keep watching something that had technically already ended. The DVD sales reinforced this proof. People were not just watching, they were buying. They were making a physical, financial commitment to the continued existence of this thing they had loved. Why? This question is worth sitting with for longer than it usually receives. The easy answer is that the show was funny and people missed it. And it was funny, and they did miss it. But lots of funny shows get canceled, and their audiences accept the cancellation without mounting what amounts to a grassroots campaign to reverse a network decision. The Family Guy audience did not simply miss the show, they missed something specific that the show had given them. And the specificity of what they were missing is revealing. The people who kept watching and buying and eventually created the conditions for the revival were, in large part, people for whom the show had done something that entertainment rarely does. It had seen them, not in the sense of representing their demographics or their life circumstances in the abstract, but in the sense of depicting the specific texture of their world with enough accuracy that watching the show produced a recognition that felt genuine. The world of the show, the Griffin family, the bar with the regulars, the working life and the domestic life, and the specific social ecosystem of a small city, all of it was recognizable in a way that most television, which tends toward aspirational rather than accurate in its depiction of daily life, was not. That recognition was what people were fighting to get back. Not just the jokes. The feeling that a piece of entertainment had looked at their world and found it worth depicting, had looked at the ordinary life they were living and decided it was interesting, had found in working-class American life the material for something that was genuinely funny, and occasionally genuinely moving, and almost always warm. The revival had to contend with this expectation, and the way it contended with it was by both honoring it and failing to honor it at the same time, which is a complicated thing to do and which the show managed with a complicated result. The revival was commercially successful in ways that were undeniable. The audience showed up, the ratings were strong, the hype was real, but the show that returned was not quite the show that the audience had been mourning. The 3 years away had done things. The writing staff had scattered when the show was canceled, as writers do when a show ends. They had found new jobs on other projects and built new working relationships and absorbed new influences, and moved on in the way that working professionals move on when the thing they were working on is no longer there to work on. When the show came back, many of the original writers were not there to come back with it. The new writers brought their own sensibilities and their own sense of what the show was, which was shaped by watching it rather than making it, which is a different kind of knowledge. McFarlane himself had changed in those 3 years. He was not the young animator pitching a 15-minute pilot anymore. He was the creator of a cultural phenomenon who had had 3 years to process what that meant. 3 years in which the show had become larger in the cultural imagination through its absence than it had been through its presence. Coming back to it in that context was different from continuing with it would have been. What the revival revealed about the original show was, paradoxically, the original show's dependency on things that could not be recreated once they were gone. The specific ensemble of writers who had been there from the beginning and who had absorbed the show's emotional logic through making it rather than watching it. The particular creative environment of a show finding its footing, which produces a kind of freedom and experimentation that shows that have already found their footing cannot quite replicate. The specific relationship between the creator and the characters, which was at its most direct and most personal in those first 3 seasons when the show was most clearly an expression of his specific sensibility. Once the revival was underway, the show was always going to be something slightly different from what it had been. The original was made under one set of conditions. The revival was made under different conditions. The show was too honest about the world it depicted to be dishonest about this. You can see the shift in the texture of the episodes, in the way the characters began moving in slightly different directions, in the way the warmth of the original became slightly less reliable in the revival seasons, even in the moments when the comedy was still working well. Something had changed. The fans who brought the show back understood they were fighting for something real. What they got back was real too, but in different proportions. The love they had invested in the original 3 seasons had preserved the show's existence, but existence is not the same as the continuation of what made something worth preserving in the first place. That distinction is one of the most honest things the show's full history has to say. Section 12. The version of Family Guy nobody watched. Here, at the end, is the show that was running underneath. It was a show about a working-class American family living in a small city in Rhode Island in the early 21st century. The father was a man who did not fully understand the world around him and loved his family with a force that routinely exceeded his ability to express it. The mother was a woman of intelligence and capability who had made a deliberate choice to build her life around people who needed her and had not once genuinely regretted that choice even when it was difficult. Even when the specific form of the difficulty was that nobody around her seemed to notice the difficulty. The daughter was a teenager who wanted nothing more than to be seen by the people around her, and had developed, in the absence of being seen, an interior life of remarkable depth and a resilience that the show kept attempting to deny, and that kept reasserting itself anyway, because resilience of that kind does not need permission. The older son was a boy, growing into the shape of his father, inheriting both the warmth and the limitations. A gentle kid, with a real talent that the household he was growing up in did not have the equipment to develop. The baby was a consciousness of extraordinary intensity, living inside a form that guaranteed he would be misunderstood by almost everyone, whose most extreme characteristic was actually his most human one, and who had found, in one unexpected friendship, the recognition that his family could not provide. The dog was a failed artist who had surrounded himself with the best possible family for someone of his specific disposition, and who carried this knowledge quietly, the way people carry the things they know but cannot say. This family went through 25 years of television. The surface version of what happened to them is well documented. The characters changed in ways that made some of them less sympathetic and more difficult to spend time with. The humor shifted in ways that alienated portions of the audience who had loved the original. The cutaways multiplied until they were doing something different from what they had originally done. The creators stepped back. The ratings dropped in ways that told a clear story, even when other metrics suggested the show was still commercially viable. The show that had been a genuinely original piece of animated comedy became something more complicated, more variable, more inconsistent, sometimes brilliant and often not. But underneath the surface, the secret version kept running. It ran in every moment when the show remembered what it was. In every episode that gave Lois a storyline about what it cost to hold a difficult household together with so little acknowledgement, so little recognition of the specific skill and specific stamina that her particular situation required. In every scene where Peter's eyes showed the specific sadness of a man who knows he is missing something he cannot name, but whose absence he feels constantly. In every beat of the Brian and Stewie friendship that demonstrated what mutual recognition looks like between two creatures who could only find it in each other. In every moment when Meg pushed through the joke to remind you that there was a person there who had not stopped being a person, regardless of what the show was currently doing with her. The secret version did not have consistent episodes. It had consistent moments. It lived in the pauses between jokes, in the looks between characters after the scene had technically moved on, in the architecture of relationships that the show built carefully in its early years, and then never entirely abandoned even when it was pulling those relationships in other directions simultaneously. It lived in the way the show kept returning to the same emotional questions regardless of the comedic territory it was nominally exploring. The question of whether the people we love can actually see us. The question of whether the lives we are living are the lives we intended to live, or the lives we arrived at and decided to call what we intended. The question of whether ordinary love is enough and what enough would mean in this context. What the secret version was doing, across 25 years, was making an argument about ordinary life. The argument was not stated explicitly, because explicit arguments are for essays and manifestos, not for animated comedies about a family in Rhode Island. The argument was made through accumulation, through the specific gravity of how characters moved through the world, through the texture of what was funny and what was not, and why the distinction between those two things kept mattering, even in the seasons when the show was less careful about the distinction than it should have been. The argument goes something like this. The working-class family in the small city. The people who go to work and come home and drink beer with their friends and fight with their spouses and worry about their children and watch too much television and do not accomplish anything that the culture recognizes as significant. These people are not a lesser version of human experience. They are the primary version, the most common version, the version that most of the people watching Family Guy actually lived or had grown up in or would recognize from someone they loved. And the love in those lives is real. The pain is real. The specific quality of loneliness that this particular kind of American life produces is real. The way families hold together through dysfunction because the alternative is worse is real. The way that children absorb their parents and become something continuous with them, while also becoming their own distinct people, is real. The way that friendships sustain people who have no other outlet for the parts of themselves that are too complicated or too private to bring into the family is real. All of it is real, and all of it was running underneath Family Guy for its entire life. Underneath the cutaways, underneath the chicken fights and the extended bits, and the deliberately offensive moments, and the escalating cruelty of the middle seasons, and all the ways the show kept choosing the louder option when a quieter one was available. Underneath all of it, a family was going about its business, loving each other imperfectly, and being loved in return imperfectly, and continuing regardless. Because that is what families do. They continue. Not because they have resolved their contradictions or healed their wounds, or become the versions of themselves they were always trying to be. They continue because the alternative is not continuing, and the people in them have decided, with whatever portion of their decision-making faculties are available at any given moment, that continuing is preferable. The secret version of Family Guy is the show that was made before the commercial machine got fully involved. It is also the show that the commercial machine could never entirely suppress, because the emotional core that the original writing team built was too substantial and too real to be fully dismantled. It kept showing up, season after season, in the gaps between the jokes, in the moments the show did not know it was creating, in the faces of the characters when the scene had technically moved on but the feeling had not finished expressing itself. It showed up because the people who were writing it and performing it had absorbed that original version too deeply to not occasionally channel it, because you do not make something with genuine care and then lose the capacity to make it that way again, even if the conditions change, even if the surrounding material changes, even if everything around the core changes. The core remains. There is a reason that people keep going back to the early seasons. Not nostalgia alone. Recognition. The early seasons gave people the specific feeling of being seen in their ordinariness, and that feeling is not something you forget easily. It stays in you. You keep reaching toward it. You keep watching a show that you sometimes complain about, that you sometimes acknowledge has not been what it was, because somewhere underneath the surface version there is the version that gave you that feeling, and you have not entirely given up on finding it again. It was there, running quietly underneath everything else, carrying all that weight, being exactly what it needed to be, which was the most honest portrait of a certain kind of American life that animated television has ever produced, wearing the costume of a show about a talking dog and a murderous baby, and a man who forgets things he should not forget, and a woman who remembers everything, and a teenage girl who just wanted to be seen. That show aired every week for 25 years. Most people did not watch it, but they felt it, and the feeling is why they kept coming back. If you made it all the way here, thank you from the bottom of my heart, genuinely. This kind of deep dive work takes real time and real thought, and knowing that there are people out there willing to lie still and let these ideas wash over them is the entire reason I keep making this. If you are not subscribed yet, please hit that button before you fall asleep. It costs nothing, and it means everything. Leave a comment down below and tell me what you thought of this one. Tell me if there is a character or a reading of the show that you think deserves more time, something I missed or something I got wrong or something I got right, in a way you had been thinking about for years without quite having the words for. I read all of it, I think about all of it. Take care of yourselves out there, sleep well, I will be here when you come back. Expansion. Going deeper into every thread. On Peter's relationship with time. Peter Griffin has a complicated relationship with time that the show never addressed directly, but which is one of the most consistent things about his character across every season. He is a man who lives primarily in the present tense, but not in the mindful, enlightened way that gets discussed in wellness culture. He lives in the present tense the way that someone who has not quite finished processing the past lives in the present, which is to say urgently, and without much long-range planning, and with a strong preference for immediate sensation over deferred gratification. This shows up most clearly in the way Peter spends money. He does not save, he does not plan for the future in any conventional financial sense. He spends what he has on what he wants now, and when that creates problems later, he deals with those problems with the same urgency and improvisational energy he brings to everything else. Lois handles whatever financial planning the household manages to accomplish, which is an asymmetry the show established early and returned to with some regularity. But underneath the comedy of Peter's financial improvidence is something that is worth taking seriously. He is a man who grew up in a household where the future was not reliably better than the present, where planning for tomorrow was a kind of luxury that the present could not always accommodate, where what you had now was more concrete and more reliable than what you might have later. This is not an irrational response to a particular kind of economic reality. It is the very rational response of someone whose experience has not consistently rewarded long-range thinking. Rhode Island's economic history bears on this. The working-class communities of New England in the second half of the 20th century were communities where the long term had become uncertain in specific and disorienting ways. Jobs that seemed secure turned out not to be. Industries that had provided stable working-class lives for generations contracted and then contracted again. Planning for a future that might not arrive in the form you planned for it became less rational than it sounds when your economic circumstances are stable. Peter's present-tense orientation is the reasonable response of a man whose understanding of how the world works was formed in a particular historical and economic context. The show never made this explicit. It never made any of this analysis explicit. But it was there in the texture of who Peter was, in the habits and the orientations and the preferences that the character displayed consistently across 25 seasons. On Lois as the show's moral center. In the early seasons of Family Guy, Lois Griffin was the closest thing the show had to a moral center. And the moral center of an animated comedy is always a more precarious position than it sounds. You cannot be too good or you become preachy. You cannot be too compromised or you lose the authority that the position requires. Lois threaded this needle with remarkable consistency, at least in those early seasons before the character started to change. She was good, the way that people who do a lot of difficult, unglamorous work tend to be good, which is without much fanfare and without apparent expectation of recognition. She held the household together. She managed the relationships between family members with a skill that was as invisible as all skilled work tends to be. She was the person who remembered everybody's needs and worked to meet them without making the work of remembering and meeting into a performance. This is a portrait of domestic labor as skilled and demanding work, which is something that popular culture has historically been bad at depicting. The stay-at-home parent, particularly the stay-at-home mother, tends to be portrayed in one of two ways, either as a saint whose selfless devotion is endless and costless, or as a figure of comedy whose concerns are small and whose satisfactions are petty. Lois was neither. She was depicted as a person with genuine intelligence and genuine ambition who had made a choice about how to deploy those things, and who brought real competence to that deployment. She also had a past, hinted at in various episodes, that suggested a person of considerable complexity. She had grown up in money. She had a wild period in her youth that the show referenced more as she aged, usually as a source of comedy. She had made choices that were not always the safe choices, and she had arrived at her current life not through default but through selection. What made Lois most interesting in the early seasons was the quality of her attention to the people around her. She paid attention to Peter in a way that was both loving and unsentimental. She saw his limitations clearly and loved him anyway, which is a more interesting emotional state than romantic blindness and harder to maintain. She paid attention to her children individually, treating each of their specific situations with a care that reflected genuine knowledge of each of them as distinct people rather than interchangeable family members. She paid attention to the household as a system, understanding how the parts related to each other and what the system needed to function. This is intelligence of a kind that doesn't always get recognized as intelligence, partly because it is deployed in a domestic rather than a professional context, and partly because it operates so smoothly that its complexity tends to be invisible. The show saw it. The early show saw it and depicted it as genuine, remarkable competence deserving of real respect. On the show's relationship with nostalgia, one of the things that made Family Guy distinctive in its early years was its relationship with nostalgia. The show was saturated in cultural references, and the references were predominantly nostalgic, pointing backward to a specific era of American popular culture rather than engaging with the current cultural moment. This was partly a reflection of the specific generational position of the show's creators and writers, who grew up in the 70s and 80s, and whose cultural touchstones were formed in those decades. But it was also doing something more specific than simple generational nostalgia. It was engaging with the particular quality of nostalgia in working-class American life, which is different from nostalgia in other social positions. Working-class nostalgia tends to be more structural, more concerned with the loss of specific economic and social conditions than with the mere loss of familiar cultural artifacts. When the bar at the Drunken Clam plays a particular song, the nostalgia that song carries is not just for the song but for the world that the song was made in, the world in which the people sitting in that bar had a more clearly defined and more reliably stable place. This is what Peter's cutaway references were doing, at their best. They were not just reaching back to funny things. They were reaching back to a specific cultural moment that represented a particular kind of security and familiarity. A time when the world was organized in ways that made sense to a person of Peter's background and temperament. The nostalgia was structural, it was grief, transmuted into comedy. This is a harder thing to do than it sounds, and it is one of the things that distinguished the early show from most of what came after. The nostalgia in the later seasons became more purely comedic, more about the recognition value of specific cultural artifacts, and less about the structural longing that the best early references carried. The humor remained. The depth underneath the humor largely departed. On Brian and The Intellectual Life of the Working Class. Brian Griffin's aspiration to be taken seriously as an intellectual is one of the show's most consistent running themes, and it is usually played for comedy at Brian's expense. He reads books and talks about them in ways that suggest more surface than depth. He has opinions about art and literature and politics that are real opinions, but are also sometimes the opinions of someone performing the having of opinions rather than genuinely working through the material. He claims credentials, sometimes truthfully and sometimes not, because the credentials are part of the costume of intellectual life that he is always partly wearing. This is a portrait of a specific kind of aspiration that is worth taking seriously as a social fact. The desire to participate in intellectual life from a position that is not socially conventional for that participation is a real experience for a lot of people. The working-class person who reads serious books. The person without a formal education who engages seriously with ideas. The dog, in this case, who talks like he went to a good university and carries the anxieties of someone who is not entirely sure the acceptance was genuine. Brian's relationship with the intellectual credentials he claims is complicated by the fact that he clearly does have genuine intelligence, genuine curiosity, and genuine engagement with ideas. The problem is not that the aspiration is fraudulent. The problem is that the aspiration is genuine and the achievement does not always match it, and the gap between them is the source of the specific pain that alcohol was designed to address. This maps onto a real social experience. The person of genuine intelligence who does not have the social capital, or the educational credentials, or the class position to be taken seriously in the context where taking ideas seriously is the norm. The person who reads and thinks and has something real to contribute, but who is consistently sorted out of the conversations where their contribution would matter. The person whose intellectual aspiration outstrips their ability to access the structures that intellectual aspiration is supposed to lead to. Brian is in this reading a working-class intellectual in the body of a dog, and the comedy of his pretensions is also the mild tragedy of someone who knows where they want to be and cannot figure out how to get there, and who has adopted the vocabulary and the affect of intellectual life as both a genuine expression of who they are and a mask for the anxiety that the gap produces. On Stewie's weapons as expression. The weapons that Stewie builds in the early seasons of Family Guy are one of the most distinctive and most underanalyzed elements of the show. They are funny, obviously. The comedy of a baby assembling a laser cannon in his bedroom while his parents wander in and out obliviously is a well-constructed piece of absurdist humor. But the weapons are also doing something specific in the emotional logic of the character. Stewie builds what he needs. The weapons are tools for the project, and the project is being taken seriously. He builds a mind control device, because if he can control minds, he can make the people around him respond to him as he actually is, rather than as they assume he is. He builds a time machine, because time is the structure within which his dependency on other people is organized, and if he can manipulate time, he can potentially escape or rearrange that structure. He builds weapons of various kinds, because weapons are the most direct possible assertion of agency, the most unambiguous way of saying to the world, I am here, I am real, my will matters. The specificity of what Stewie builds in any given episode tends to match the specific frustration he is working with in that episode. When he is frustrated with Lois specifically, he builds something pointed at Lois. When he is frustrated with his general situation, his plans tend toward world domination, which is the fantasy of reordering the entire system rather than addressing any individual within it. This is a portrait of a specific kind of creative problem-solving that develops in children who are smarter than their environment can accommodate. You cannot address the actual problem directly, because the actual problem is structural, and you are not in a position to change the structure. So you build something, you make something, you use the intelligence and the energy that the frustration generates to create external objects that express and contain what you cannot otherwise express and contain. For most such children, the things they make are not laser cannons. They are drawings or stories or complex games with elaborate rules or intricate organizational systems or any of the other forms that creative problem-solving takes when the problem is too large to solve and the energy has to go somewhere. Stewie makes laser cannons because he is living in an animated comedy and because the laser cannons are the form that best expresses, visually and comedically, the scale of what he is working with. On the question of who was actually watching, when Family Guy premiered in 1999 and pulled in 22 million viewers on the night after the Super Bowl, those viewers were not all the same people. The Super Bowl audience is the broadest possible American television audience, spanning demographics that rarely watch the same thing at the same time. Some portion of those 22 million people watched the first episode and decided it was not for them. Some watched it and were indifferent. Some watched it and recognized something. The people who recognized something were the ones who kept watching. And the people who kept watching through the show's rocky early history, who found it in the Adult Swim reruns and kept coming back even after the network kept moving it around and eventually canceled it, who bought the DVD sets and told other people about the show, and eventually contributed to the unusual reversal of a network cancellation decision. These people were telling you something about what the show was by virtue of their loyalty. They were telling you that the show had given them the specific feeling of being seen in a way that was unusual and that they wanted more of. The demographics of Family Guy's most loyal early audience were working class and working class adjacent, were people in their 20s and 30s who had grown up in the kinds of households and communities that the show depicted, were people who found in the Griffin family a reflection of something they recognized as real. This is not a comprehensive account of who watched Family Guy. The show always had a broad audience that included many people who watched it purely for the jokes and had no particular investment in its emotional content. But the people whose loyalty was most intense, whose advocacy was most active, whose relationship with the show was most personal, these people were responding to the secret version. They were the ones who felt what was running underneath. The show's later commercial success was built on a different kind of audience, one that was there for the virality and the cutaway clips and the spectacle, rather than for the specific texture of the world the original show had built. Both audiences are legitimate. Both had real relationships with what they were watching. But the second audience was watching a different show from the first, and the first audience knew the difference even when they could not always articulate it. On the question of what was lost when MacFarlane stepped back, the conventional account of what happened to Family Guy when MacFarlane stepped back from active creative involvement in around 2011 focuses on quality control. The creator was no longer in the room making sure the show was good. Without the creator, the show got worse. This is true as far as it goes. But what was lost was something more specific than general quality control. What was lost was a particular creative sensibility, a specific way of seeing the world and the characters in it, that had been the organizing intelligence behind the early show, and that could not be transferred to other people, even very talented people who cared about the show. Creative sensibilities are not sets of rules. You cannot hand them off as instructions. They are ways of feeling about material, ways of knowing intuitively when something is right and when something has gone wrong, ways of understanding what a character would actually do, as opposed to what it would be convenient for a character to do in service of a given plot. MacFarlane knew his characters the way people know the people they have lived with for a long time. He knew the difference between Peter doing something foolish in a way that was consistent with who Peter was, and Peter doing something foolish in a way that served the joke but was not quite true to the character. That knowledge lived in him and not on paper, and when he was no longer actively exercising it, the show began to drift in ways that were subtle at first and less subtle as the seasons accumulated. The later showrunners were competent professionals who had lived with the show for years and cared about it. But caring about something and being its original creative intelligence are different things, and the difference showed. The later seasons had good episodes. They had great moments, but they had less of the specific coherence that comes from a single creative sensibility organizing the material, less of the sense that everything on screen was the expression of one person's way of seeing the world and the people in it. What was lost is not recoverable. The show that the original 3 seasons were could not have continued for 25 years even if MacFarlane had stayed fully involved, because nothing is that good for that long without changing, and the specific conditions that produced those 3 seasons could not be reproduced. But what was lost when the creator stepped back was not just quality in the abstract. It was the living memory of what the show had been, the person who carried that memory most completely, and the daily exercise of judgment that would have kept the show in closer alignment with its original self. Final expansion. The full picture on why the show kept getting renewed, despite declining ratings. There is something instructive in the fact that Family Guy kept getting renewed even as its ratings went from millions of viewers to a small fraction of that number. By season 23, fewer than 750,000 people were watching new episodes on their original broadcast night. That is not a large audience for a network television show. It is smaller than the audience for many shows that have been canceled without ceremony. And yet Family Guy kept going. The show was renewed not once, but multiple times after the ratings had dropped to levels that would have ended most shows. It was signed to a deal that extended it through its 30th anniversary. It kept going because the economics of animation in the streaming era are different from the economics of live-action television, and because a recognizable brand with 25 years of content has value that first-run viewership numbers do not capture. The entire library of Family Guy was sitting on streaming platforms generating revenue every time someone watched an old episode. The show was in reruns on cable. It was generating merchandise revenue from a broad range of licensed products. It was, in the business sense, a franchise that happened to still be producing new content, rather than a show that was still being primarily judged by whether that new content was good. This dynamic is one of the strangest things about the current moment in television, which is that a show can exist in a state where its commercial value and its creative quality have become almost entirely disconnected from each other. Family Guy was commercially valuable because it had been good in the past. Whether it was good in the present was essentially irrelevant to the business case for its continued existence. The business case was about the catalog and the brand and the licensing agreements, not about the 42 minutes of new content that aired on Wednesday nights. This is what it looks like when a show has truly become a product rather than an art. Not when it stops being good, because lots of products are good, but when the decision to keep making it is no longer connected in any meaningful way to whether the making of it is producing something worth having. Family Guy was going to keep going regardless of whether any given season was worth watching, because the thing that was keeping it going was not the current season at all. On what the show got right that it never got credit for, Family Guy is not typically discussed as a show that was doing something formally interesting. It is discussed as a show that was funny, or that used to be funny, or that was funny in a particular way, that was either innovative or derivative depending on who you ask. The formal innovation of the show, if it had one, is credited to the cutaway format, which is significant, but is also the most visible and most commented upon element, and therefore tends to overshadow everything else. What the show did not get credit for, and what deserves more attention than it receives, is its handling of time. Family Guy exists in a kind of perpetual present tense that is actually much harder to manage than it looks. The children never grow up, even as the show ages around them. Characters age in some respects but not in others. The timeline is elastic in ways that the show treats with a casualness that disguises the genuine difficulty of maintaining a coherent fictional world under those conditions. This approach to time is not a failure of continuity, though it often gets described as one. It is a deliberate choice about what kind of show this is, and what kind of world the show exists in. Family Guy inhabits a kind of eternal present, a perpetual now where the same dynamics repeat and the same people keep being who they are, because the show is less interested in what happens to its characters over time than in who its characters are at any given moment. This is actually one of the show's most honest formal choices, because it corresponds to something true about how the ordinary life that the show was depicting actually works. The rhythms of working-class domestic life tend to be cyclical rather than developmental. The same fights, the same pleasures, the same bar on the same night with the same people. Not because nothing ever changes, but because the pace of change in these kinds of lives tends to be slower and less dramatic than the pace of change in the kinds of lives that typically get depicted in narrative television. By existing in an eternal present, by refusing to resolve its characters into settled final versions of themselves, Family Guy was doing something formally appropriate to the material it was working with. It was saying, this is what this kind of life looks like, which is the same and the same and the same, with small variations, and the sameness is not a failure of imagination, but a true depiction of a particular kind of ongoing human experience. On the audience that the show was actually talking to, the audience that Family Guy was most fundamentally talking to, in its original form, was the American working class, and specifically the generation of the American working class that came of age in the economic and cultural context of the 1970s through the 1990s. This is a generation that grew up in households where certain material certainties existed that do not exist in the same form anymore, where the combination of a working job and a house in a small city constituted a full life that was not aspirational, but was genuinely sustainable. A generation that absorbed a particular cultural landscape, the television shows and the movies and the music of those decades, and that carried those absorbed things forward into an adult life that increasingly did not resemble the life those cultural artifacts had been made for. Peter Griffin is this generation. He is a man who is living the life his parents' generation lived, in roughly the same way they lived it, in roughly the same place they lived it, and who is finding that the fit between his life and his moment is slightly off, in ways that produce a persistent low-grade confusion. The world has changed around him in ways that he has not fully registered. The economic conditions that once made his kind of life stable and respected have shifted. The cultural landscape that once reflected his world back to him in flattering ways has moved on to other subjects and other social positions. The show was saying, to the people who lived in this world, you are real, your world is real, the things you love and the ways you are, and the specific texture of your particular experience of American life are worth depicting and worth taking seriously. This is a thing that popular entertainment rarely says and rarely means, and the people for whom the show said it most clearly were the people who responded with the most loyalty. The cutaways to specific cultural artifacts from the 1970s and 1980s were not just nostalgia in the generic sense. They were a form of cultural recognition, a way of saying to a specific audience, I know what you know. I remember what you remember. The things that live in your head are in my head too. We come from the same place. That act of recognition is one of the most powerful things that popular entertainment can do, and it is one of the things that the early seasons of Family Guy did better than almost anything else in its genre. On the show as a document of its moment. There is another way to think about Family Guy as a whole, which is as an accidental document of a particular moment in American cultural history. The show started in 1999 and ran through the first quarter of the 21st century, and that period in American life was one of the most eventful and most disorienting in recent memory. Economic upheavals, technological transformations, cultural shifts of enormous scope and speed. The particular kind of American working-class life that the show had been built to depict became, over the course of the show's run, an increasingly contested and increasingly uncertain thing. The show did not engage with most of this directly. It was a comedy, not a social documentary, and it had made a formal commitment to a kind of eternal present that insulated it from having to address the changes happening around it. But the changes showed up anyway, in the texture of how the characters related to the world, in the ways the humor shifted, in the increasing reliance on shock and spectacle, as the gentler comedy of recognition became harder to sustain. The decline of the surface version of Family Guy is, partly, the decline of the cultural conditions that had made the original show possible. The specific working-class world that the early seasons had depicted with warmth and precision was changing, and the show was changing with it, not because it chose to track the changes, but because the people making it were living through those changes and could not help but be shaped by them. The secret version of the show ran throughout this period, maintaining its original emotional priorities even as everything around it shifted. It was the ship's hull below the waterline, while the decks above were being rearranged. It held. It kept doing its work. It was what the show was made of, at the most fundamental level, and foundations tend to be the last thing to go even when everything built on top of them is changing. That is the full picture. A show that was funnier than it was credited for being honest, more honest than it was credited for being careful, more careful than it was credited for being, at its best, genuinely good. And underneath all of it, a family going about its business in a small city in Rhode Island, loving each other imperfectly, getting through the days, being exactly as ordinary and exactly as ordinary life always is, when you look at it closely enough to see it clearly. That was the secret version of Family Guy. It ran for 25 years, and it is still there, in every episode, if you know where to look. If this was the right kind of company for tonight, I am glad. Subscribe if you want more of it. Drop a comment to let me know what landed and what did not. And sleep well. You have earned it. On the specific sadness of a show that almost stayed great. There are shows that decline, and the decline is easy to understand because the decline was baked in from the beginning. Shows that were never quite as good as their reputation, that got their cultural footprint through timing and cultural saturation, rather than genuine craft, and whose falling off was always eventually going to happen because there was never quite enough underneath to sustain a long run. Those shows are not sad cases. They are just shows that had their moment and then did not. Family Guy is a different kind of case. Family Guy was genuinely excellent in its original form. Not just good for its genre, not just good for an animated comedy, but genuinely excellent in ways that hold up to serious attention and that produce things the medium had not produced before in quite that form. The character of Stewie in those first 3 seasons was one of the most original creations in the history of animated television. The specific emotional honesty of the early Peter-Lois relationship was a genuine achievement. The portrait of working-class American life that the show built in its original run was the most sustained and the most accurate that the form had ever attempted. Given all of that, the decline is specifically sad in a way that the decline of a lesser show would not be. It is sad because you can see, in the early seasons, exactly what was possible. You can see the potential that was there. You can see the show that the show was capable of being, and then track Season by season, the ways in which that potential went unrealized or got redirected into something less. The writer's strike of 2007 broke something in the show's creative rhythm that was never fully repaired. The 3-year gap between the original run and the revival scattered the writing team that had developed the show's original voice and replaced it with a team that had a different relationship to the material. McFarlane's gradual withdrawal from active creative involvement removed the central intelligence that had been organizing everything. The commercial pressures that came with enormous success pushed the show toward the reliable and the repeatable rather than toward the risky and the new. None of these individual factors would have been fatal on their own. Many shows survive a writer's strike. Many shows survive cast changes or writing staff changes. Many shows survive their creator becoming less hands-on as the project grows. But in Family Guy's case, these factors all arrived together in a relatively short span of years, during the period when the show was also expanding rapidly in a commercial sense and when the expectations around it were highest. The show that emerged from this combination of factors was not bad. It was not without merit. It had good episodes and good moments, and genuinely brilliant things scattered throughout seasons that were otherwise inconsistent. But it was not what it had been, and the distance between what it had been and what it became is the measure of a specific kind of loss, the loss of a potential that had been clearly visible and was never fully realized. What the show taught about character. One of the most underappreciated things about the early seasons of Family Guy is what they taught, through example, about how animated characters work at their best. Characters in animation are abstractions. They are drawn rather than photographed. They do not have the physical specificity of real human actors, the infinite variation of faces and bodies and presences that makes live-action characters feel grounded in a particular physical reality. Animated characters have to achieve depth through other means. The early Family Guy characters achieved depth through the specific consistency of their emotional logic. You could predict how Peter would respond to a situation, not because the show had told you rules about Peter, but because you understood the specific way Peter's mind worked, the specific orientation toward the world that was his alone and that produced its specific outputs reliably. The same was true for Lois, for Brian, for Stewie, for Meg, for Chris. Each of them had an interior logic that was consistent enough to generate real expectation and surprising enough to generate real pleasure when it expressed itself in new ways. This is what good character writing in any medium produces. Characters who are surprising in ways that feel inevitable in retrospect, because the surprise comes from the character's own nature rather than from the writer's external imposition. When Peter did something foolish in the early seasons, it was always foolish in a Peter-specific way, a way that made sense given who Peter was and how he processed the world. When Brian did something touching in those same seasons, it was touching in a Brian-specific way that grew from the specific texture of his loneliness and his failed ambition and his genuine affection for the people around him. The later seasons lost this specificity gradually, and then more completely. Peter became foolish in a generic way, a cartoon buffoon, rather than a specific person. Brian became pompous in a generic way, an intellectual phony rather than a specific creature with specific anxieties. Stewie became quirky in a generic way, an eccentric sidekick rather than a specific consciousness with a specific history. The loss of specificity is the loss of everything that made the characters feel real, and when the characters stopped feeling real, the show stopped producing the specific pleasure of recognition that had made it so important to its most loyal viewers. You can still laugh at cartoons that are not real, but you cannot recognize yourself in them the way you could recognize yourself in the early versions of these characters, and recognition was what the secret version of the show had been offering all along. What the next person who does this right will learn from Family Guy. When the next great working-class American animated comedy is made, its creators will learn something from Family Guy. Not from the show in the abstract, not from its reputation or its cultural footprint, but from the specific things it did in its original seasons that produced its original effect. They will learn that the comedy of ordinary life is not reducible to the comedy of stupidity. Ordinary people are not stupid. They are people operating with the tools they have, in the conditions they have, and the comedy of that situation is the comedy of specifically human limitations meeting specifically human circumstances, not the comedy of deficiency. The early Peter was funny because he was specifically himself running into a world that was specifically not designed for him, not because he was a buffoon abstractly defined. They will learn that the warmth in an animated comedy has to be real warmth, not performed warmth. The early Family Guy was warm because the people who made it genuinely cared about the characters they were depicting, genuinely saw them as real, genuinely found them worth spending time with. That kind of warmth cannot be manufactured through writing choices. It is either there in the orientation of the people making the show, or it is not. They will learn that the working-class world is a legitimate subject for serious comedy, that the people in it are not simply comic relief for a show about something else, that their lives and their loves and their specific quality of longing and their particular relationship with loss and time and possibility are as rich and as worthy of depiction as anything in any other social register. They will learn that the specific is more powerful than the general, that a show about a particular family in a particular town in a particular moment of American history has more resonance than a show about families in general, because the particular is where everyone actually lives and the general is where nobody actually lives. They will learn all of this from Family Guy, and they will make something better with it, because they will have the benefit of knowing what worked and what was lost, and they will be able to start from a place of knowledge that the original creators had to arrive at through the process of making the show itself. Family Guy will have done something genuinely useful in that case. It will have made a map of a territory that is worth exploring, even if the map is imperfect, even if large sections of it turn out to be slightly wrong. The territory was real, the attempt to map it was real, and the map, imperfect as it is more than most shows of any kind ever produce. That is a legacy worth having, even if it is not the legacy the show's most devoted early audience was hoping for. Even if it is not the legacy that those 22 million viewers who watched the first episode after the Super Bowl in 1999 could have predicted. Even if the secret version of the show never got the recognition that the secret version deserved. It was there. It ran for 25 years. And the people who felt it knew what they were feeling. The last thing, on watching something you love change. There is a specific grief that comes with watching something you love change in ways you did not choose and would not have chosen, and it is different from the grief of losing something. When you lose something, it is gone, and the absence is the whole shape of what you are mourning. When something changes, it is still there. You can still find it. The show is still on television. The episodes still exist. You can still watch it. But the thing you are watching is different from the thing you loved, and the original thing is not accessible to you in any live form, only in the form of what it was before. This is the situation of the most loyal Family Guy viewers, the ones who found the show in its original run or in the Adult Swim reruns, and who felt what the show was doing underneath its surface comedy, and who loved it for that. They are watching a show that has changed so significantly that the version they loved is no longer what is being produced. The original characters have been altered. The original warmth has been cooled. The original insight into a particular kind of American life has been replaced, partially, with something louder and less precise. And yet the original version has not been destroyed. It is still there in every episode that was made in those first 3 seasons. It is still there in the better episodes of the revival and the middle seasons. It is still there, running quietly, in the moments of every later season when the show remembers what it is. The version of the show that they loved is not gone. It is embedded in the larger show, the way a fossil is embedded in a rock, available to anyone who knows where to look and how to look. The grief of this situation is not the clean grief of loss. It is the complicated grief of change, of being able to see what something was, while also seeing what it has become, of holding both versions simultaneously, and knowing they are the same show and not the same show at all, of loving something that is still there but is not quite what it was. Every long-running piece of popular entertainment produces this grief in its most devoted audience eventually, because nothing that runs long enough can stay exactly what it was when it started. The conditions change, the people change, the world changes. The thing changes with it, because the thing is made by people living in the world, and the world does not hold still. The question is not whether a show will change, but how it will change, and what will be preserved and what will be lost, and whether the preservation of the most essential things is possible alongside the inevitable transformation of everything else. Family Guy's answer to this question, over 25 years, was complicated. The most essential things were not always preserved. Some of them were lost, but some of them were not. The marriage persisted. The friendship persisted. The town persisted. The emotional logic of the original characters persisted in traces, in moments, in the gaps between the surface comedy. The secret version ran throughout. Whether that is enough depends on what you think you were owed. If you were owed a show that stayed exactly what it was in its best moments for 25 years, Family Guy failed you. No show could have given you that. But Family Guy failed more thoroughly than some might have. If you were owed a show that remembered, at least occasionally and in the right moments, what it had been and what had made it worth loving, then Family Guy gave you that. Not consistently, not reliably, but genuinely, in the moments when the foundation asserted itself through whatever was built on top of it. The secret version kept running. It kept running. And on a certain kind of night, when you put on an old episode or found one of the better later ones, the version of the show that had seen you all those years ago would be briefly visible again. Would say the thing it had been saying from the beginning, which is that this ordinary life, this working life, this life of a specific kind of American family in a small city, doing its best with what it has, is worth seeing, is real, is here. That is what Family Guy was. That is what it kept being, underneath everything, for 25 years. And it is still there, in the episodes, if you go looking for it. It always was. A note on how to watch it now. If you want to experience the secret version of Family Guy, there is a way to do it. It does not require watching every episode in order, though that has its own rewards. It requires watching with a particular quality of attention, a willingness to let the surface comedy do its work, while also keeping some part of your attention on what is moving underneath it. Watch the Peter scenes, looking not at what he is doing, but at what he is feeling. Watch his face in the moments between the jokes, in the beats where the scene is transitioning and nothing is required of the comedy. Look for the moments when Peter looks at Lois with something that is not performing and not being funny. Just looking, just being there. Those moments are brief, and they are not always there, but in the early seasons they are there consistently, and they are the signal of the show that was running underneath. Watch the Meg scenes looking not at the punchline but at the response. In the early seasons especially, watch how Meg receives the ordinary indignities of her life, the way she processes them without drama, the way she continues to function and to hope and to try. The resilience is not in the dialogue, it is in the continuing. Watch for the continuing. Watch the Brian scenes looking for the moments when the performance drops. Brian performs his intellectual self-presentation most of the time, but there are moments, scattered throughout the early seasons especially, when the performance is momentarily suspended, and you see the character who was underneath it the whole time. The dog who ended up in the right place and knows it, and is grateful for it, even when everything else is uncertain. Watch the Stewie scenes in the early seasons looking not at the comedy of the evil baby but at what the evil baby is expressing. Look for the moments when Stewie is looking at Lois with the specific intensity of someone who needs desperately to be seen. The weapons are a performance too, in a way. What Stewie is performing is the need to be taken seriously, and the performance is both very funny and very real. Watch the town. Watch the bar. Watch the way the specific physical environment of the show reflects the specific economic and social reality that the show was built to depict. Watch the way the Drunken Clam is exactly the kind of bar it should be for the kind of people who go there, and understand that this specificity is not accidental, but is the result of someone having paid attention to the real world closely enough to know what that bar should look and feel like. Watch the marriage. Watch every episode through the lens of what is happening between Peter and Lois. Not just in the scenes that are explicitly about their relationship, but in every scene where both characters appear. Watch the way they navigate each other, the specific grammar of a long relationship that has its own syntax and its own shorthand and its own history that is visible in how they move through the same space together. If you watch all of this, you will be watching the secret version of Family Guy. You will be watching the show that was running underneath. You will be watching the most honest and the most affecting piece of work that the show produced across its entire run, which was not any single episode, but the whole thing, the complete 25-year portrait of a family going about its business in a world that was not always kind to them, but that they continued to inhabit with the ordinary courage that ordinary life always requires. That show is still there, in every episode, waiting to be seen. And now you know where to look. Sleep well, and if this script kept you company tonight, that matters. That is the whole point. Leave a comment, let me know where you were watching from, and what time it was, and whether any of this landed. Every comment is read, every one of them is thought about. This community is the reason these scripts exist, and the reason they will keep existing. Subscribe if you want to be here when the next one arrives. Take care of yourselves out there. The ordinary life is always worth the attention. The specific sadness of things that almost stayed great is always worth naming. The version of things that ran underneath the version everyone watched is always the part that lasts longest. Always the part that surfaces in the small hours when everything else is quiet. Always the thing that made the thing worth anything at all. Family Guy had that. It had it for 25 years. It is in there still. Go find it.